In a world where the moon is undergoing a catastrophic mutation, temperatures have skyrocketed above 100 degrees Celsius. The surface of the Earth has become so unbearably hot that power plants explode from the heat. Stepping outside for more than 20 seconds leads to instant fainting, and touching the asphalt results in melting. Society is confined indoors, making supplies the most precious commodity. Our protagonist has managed to survive for 5 years with his girlfriend. However, as their supplies dwindled, she betrayed him by sending someone to kill him before everything ran out. Now, 5 years back in time, he has a chance to change everything. With the ability to stockpile food and resources, he vows to accumulate 3 billion resources and become the cruelest person seeking revenge. Currently, our protagonist finds himself on a bus where passengers discuss a recent earthquake at Mount Fuji that killed dozens and prompted the evacuation of their city. A girl in a tight pink dress laments that she couldn't even buy supplies before leaving, while a man beside her mentions the mysterious disappearance of supplies from surrounding cities. Another man with shaved hair recounts similar occurrences at Dongming Lake in Shunqing City and the Durundong warehouse. Amidst their conversation, our protagonist interjects, explaining that the missing supplies are worth trillions of yuan. He warns that the natural disasters and disappearances indicate something significant is happening. The girl anxiously asks if it's the end of the world, while a guy in a green shirt expresses excitement, believing it will bring equality. However, our protagonist knows better. Inequality will only worsen, as he experienced firsthand in his past life. Once he was an ordinary delivery guy, his life turned upside down when the apocalypse began. Heat waves scorched the earth, tectonic plates shifted, and creatures emerged from the core. The world changed overnight, and in this new order, even basic supplies like instant noodles became worth millions yuan. A single sausage could buy any favor. Reborn a month before it all started, our protagonist is determined to be better prepared this time. The girl in the pink dress clings to him, seeking comfort, but he leaves, knowing there are more important things to do. As he gets off the bus, he wonders in an apocalypse what's the most important things. Clearly it's resources. In an apocalypse, supplies and resources are paramount. In his last life, he wasted his time searching for them, but this time he must be prepared in advance. As his boss announces a pay cut, he apologizes, knowing he will soon have all the supplies he needs. Working at Walmart, he remembers how his boss hoarded supplies and fled during the first apocalypse. This time, he decides to take matters into his own hands. He opens the warehouse and activates his system, which detects nearby supplies and transports them to his spatial space, a massive area over 10,000 meters in dimension where time is frozen, keeping the food perfect indefinitely. He has been secretly stockpiling water from lakes and supplies from cities destined for destruction. Finally, he feels prepared. As he finishes, 3 co-workers enter the now empty warehouse and demand an explanation. Our protagonist calmly reveals that he took everything. The boss, baffled by Su Chen's actions, orders his 2 subordinates to apprehend him. As they approach, Su Chen steps back and mysteriously vanishes into thin air, leaving them puzzled and wondering where he disappeared to. Outside, Su Chen reappears thanks to his second ability, spatial jump. With this power, he can teleport up to 3 meters away, making it easier to gather supplies and escape unnoticed. He tosses his uniform into the air, declaring, "Collection complete." Just then, a message from the authorities pops up on his phone, warning about strange movements on Earth and urging everyone to be cautious as a disaster could strike. But there's no need to panic. Su Chen finds this curious, as the real chaos hasn't started yet. Do they somehow know the future? His phone rings. It's his girlfriend, Jiang Shaoqian. Sighing, he answers. She scolds him for putting their house up for sale, questioning his responsibility. Even though she doesn't want the house, she demands he prove himself by transferring the house to her for security. Su Chen calmly asks if she has anything else to say. She continues, saying if he hands over the house, she'll give him another chance. Otherwise, he can forget about marrying her. Su Chen hangs up without a word. He recalls the past 5 years of the apocalypse, tirelessly hunting for supplies to feed her and taking her to safe zones. If it weren't for him, she would have starved in the early days. He vividly remembers the day he returned home, only to be attacked because he wasn't bringing in enough supplies. They accused him of hiding something. After they killed him, they celebrated next to his body. Zhang Xiaoqian coldly told her new lover, Wang Haoyu, that Su Chen died because he was useless and incompetent. Devastated by the betrayal, Su Chen vows that Zhang Xiaoqian and Wang Haoyu will pay dearly in this new life. They won't die easily. They will feel the pain he felt 100 times over. Calming himself, Su Chen realizes he needs money to buy the things not found in the market. He calls a guy named Lu, offering to sell his house at half price for immediate payment. When he arrives at the real estate agency, Zhang Xiaoqian is there, furious that he kept her waiting. Ignoring her, he walks past. Wang Haoyu confronts him, threatening that if he sells the house again, he won't see another sunrise. At that moment, Su Chen, now skilled in combat after surviving the apocalypse, grabs Wang Haoyu by the neck and throws him to the ground, asserting, I can do whatever I want with my things. Zhang Xiaoqian, scared by Su Chen's sudden aggression, tries to stop him but receives a slap, falling to the ground in disbelief. Meanwhile, Wang Haoyu begs Su Chen to let him go, saying he's almost suffocating. Su Chen reassures him, Don't worry, you won't die so easily, and releases him, leaving him shocked and gasping on the ground. Su Chen enters the real estate agency, ignoring Zhang Xiaoqian's threats that if he kneels down and apologizes, she'll consider his case. He glances back at them, and they flee in fear. Inside, the attendant offers Su Chen some water and quickly agrees to buy his house. The realtor plans to make a profit by reselling it, as Su Chen is selling a 1,000,000 yuan house for 700,000 yuan. Su Chen agrees to sell but demands full payment immediately. The realtor consents, planning to finalize everything by tomorrow morning. Su Chen knows that houses will soon lose all value as the temperatures rise, despite the current calm. Walking down the street, Su Chen spots a poster advertising quick loans and decides to visit with his house certificate. He's shocked to find that the lender is the older brother of the man he just beat up. Su Chen knows this guy will be one of the first to die in the apocalypse. The lender offers 500,000 yuan, but Su Chen demands an additional 100,000 yuan, promising to win it all back at the casino in a week. The lender, seeing Su Chen as a reckless gambler, agrees and transfers 600,000 yuan. Meanwhile, Zhang Xiaoqian and Wang Haoyu are furious and decide to confront Su Chen. They spot him, and Wang Haoyu grabs his neck in fear, but decides to follow him instead. Su Chen remembers that several buildings will collapse due to upcoming tsunamis, but the Green City Hotel will withstand all disasters. He decides the presidential suite, with its pool and ample food supplies, is a good base. At the hotel, Su Chen is greeted by the attendant, Lu Xinrui. He requested 1,000 table for a banquet, startling her. He specifies the most expensive tables, costing 10,000 yuan each, and makes a deposit of 500,000 yuan. Lu Xinrui, though incredulous, leads him to finalize the payment, thinking he must be very wealthy. Su Chen explains that the banquet is for a wedding and also secures the presidential suite. Later, as Su Chen leaves the hotel, pleased with his acquisition of over 10 million yuan in food for just 500,000 yuan, Zhang Xiaoqian appears and asks the attendant what Su Chen was doing. Lu Xinrui tells her about the extravagant banquet and the 500,000 yuan deposit. Zhang Xiaoqian is stunned, and Wang Haoyu refuses to believe that Su Chen has so much money. Lu Xinrui shows them the transfer receipt, confirming the payment. On the street, Wang Haoyu asks Zhang Xiaoqian who Su Chen plans to invite to a 1,000-person banquet. Confidently, Zhang Xiaoqian replies, You really don't understand, do you? He's trying to introduce me to the circle of millionaires he knows. Only then will he reveal my identity. Wang Haoyu wants to venture into the mountains, but Zhang Xiaoqian slaps him, determined to stay close to Su Chen. Imagining herself as a wealthy lady, she sees an opportunity to elevate her status and decides to create as many chances as possible to remain with Su Chen. Zhang Xiaoqian never imagined she'd have to marry Su Chen, the loser. As she dives herself into her delusional daydreaming, her eyes become sparkle. Meanwhile, Su Chen is tallying his resources, 700,000 yuan from selling his house, 600,000 yuan from a loan, and 500,000 yuan for the banquet. With his name soon to be tarnished, he decides to take out even more loans. Installing multiple banking apps on his phone, he creates over 80 accounts and manages to secure an additional 970,000 yuan. Now, Suchin focuses on essential survival items not available in markets. He buys a fireplace, an ice-making machine, ice blocks, smokeless charcoal, and other necessities online. With fast delivery, he orders 2,000 tons of smokeless charcoal and reserves ice from a factory. Walking down the street, Suchin encounters Lena, a friend of Jiang Shaoqian. She tells him that Jiang Shaoqian misses him. Knowing Lena always spoke ill of him, Suchin retorts, "Miss me? She must miss my house." Lena tries to play along, but Suchin dismisses her. Jiang Shaoqian rushes to apologize, feeling embarrassed and asking Suchin to accompany her for a walk. He ignores her, prompting Jiang Shaoqian to lose her temper, while Lena suggests they follow him to see what he's up to. Suchin arrives at the ice factory, where the owner is impressed by his youth. Suchin asks if the 2,000 tons of edible ice are ready. The attendant, who guarantees fast delivery, requires a small deposit. Suchin transfers 100,000 yuan, ensuring delivery in 3 days. When the attendant asks why he needs so much ice, Suchin says it's for a charity event and leaves. Shortly after, Jiang Shaoqian and Lena arrive at the factory. Jiang Shaoqian claims Suchin is her boyfriend and asks what he ordered. The seller reveals Suchin ordered 800,000 yuan worth of ice. Both women are shocked. Lena asks what Suchin plans to do with all that ice. The seller mentions it's for charity, leaving them puzzled. Later, Suchin heads to one of the city's fanciest restaurants. In his past life, he never enjoyed such luxuries. He spots a dish priced at 17,000 yuan and orders it. The chef, Duanya, known as the Hell's Chef during the apocalypse for her ability to turn corpses into edible food, brings him the dish. Suchin recognizes her and compliments the meal, thinking it would be wonderful to have her cook for him. Outside, Jiang Shaoqian and Lena discuss Suchin's apparent wealth. Jiang Shaoqian dreams of becoming a rich wife, while Suchin decides to visit an expensive bar. Surrounded by girls, he starts drinking. A girl next to him shares her heartbreak story, and Suchin explains men's instincts. She asks if he's single, leading to a moment of connection. Jiang Shaoqian and Lena entered the bar, searching for Suchin. They spot him with the girls, and he takes one to a room. Jiang Shaoqian and Lena shouted at him to stop, but Suchin and the girl run into the room and lock the door. Inside, the girl nervously reveals it's her first time. Suchin, feeling awkward, flicks her forehead and advises her to stock up on food and stay safe. He leaves, thinking it's a shame he couldn't seize the opportunity. As Jiang Shaoqian and Lena kick down doors, Suchin easily slips away. The next day, Suchin receives all the delivery trucks, from ice and charcoal to banquet supplies. The crowd is confused, wondering why Suchin rented such a huge warehouse just to receive so much stuff. Even Jiang Shaoqian is puzzled about what he's doing. At that moment, Lena points out that the banquet from the Green City Hotel has arrived. Workers are laying out carpets and organizing tables beautifully. Could it be that a bunch of people will suddenly arrive, and he will declare his love and propose? Jiang Shaoqian, acting all high and mighty, says that even if he proposes, she'll still think about his case. They decide they need to see his sincerity and go talk to him. She then goes to Suchin and asks why he's buying so much stuff. Suchin says he'll explain later, but asks if she can help him organize everything. Jiang Shaoqian is scared, thinking he's a jerk for making a girl who's about to become rich soon do such hard work. Lena suggests it must be some kind of test to see if she's qualified to become a rich girl. At that, Jiang Shaoqian changes her attitude and says she's not the weak type of woman. She knows how to be delicate but also knows how to work and starts carrying the boxes, though she's dying of anger, thinking that when she becomes a rich woman, Suchin will pay. At that moment, Lena tries to seduce him, offering to help carry the boxes. She's sure that someone as rich as him won't have just one woman. As long as she shows a bit of what she has to offer, she might at least get to enjoy a little. Meanwhile, Suchin is thinking he can't lose free labor like this. After all, with so much ice and so many tables to set up, they'll need help. Time passes, and they finally finish everything. Jiang Shaoqian is dripping with sweat, and her legs are shaking. She says she's been carrying stuff since morning and vows that once she becomes his wife, she'll make sure to take all his money. Lena, lying on the ground, is also exhausted, saying that Su-chun really made them carry those heavy ice boxes. Jiang Shaoqian says enough of this test. He has to propose to her right away and start the party before the guests arrive. Lena agrees, urging him to hurry up because the food is getting cold. Meanwhile, Su-chun gives a good amount of extra money to all the delivery guys, who thank him from the bottom of their hearts. At that moment, Jiang Shaoqian comes and asks Su-chun if he has something to tell her. Su-chun thanks her for the help but says, unfortunately, there's no payment for them, so they can leave now. Jiang Shaoqian is shocked and tells him to stop joking. The guests are already arriving, and there are 1,000 tables. Why doesn't he just reveal that he wants to marry her so they can have a good life? Su-chun looks back and says that's impossible for him. After all, he's already sold the house and accumulated a bunch of debts. Lena says that doesn't make sense. How can someone with no money buy so much ice? Su-chun explains he's only doing all this to help his very rich boss, who wants to do a charity project. Jiang Shaoqian loses her temper and attacks him, saying he's been lying to her the whole time. Su-chun says he hasn't lied about anything. She falls to the ground with a monstrous look, calling him a poor loser who can forget about marrying her. Su-chun says he's not interested at all. She angrily leaves, saying he's a bastard and will regret it. As they both leave, Su-chun thinks they'll regret it once the apocalypse starts. He then closes the warehouse door to start storing everything in his space, feeling satisfied with his preparations. Back at the hotel, Wang Dahai, the guy he borrowed money from, and he's also Wang Haoyu's big brother, is telling Jiang Shaoqian to follow Wang Haoyu and be a good girl, promised her to have a good life if she do so. Wang Haoyu pulls Jiang Shaoqian aside and tells her not to pay attention to that loser Su-chun anymore. She should stick with him all the time anyway. She's grinding her teeth, looking forward to his performance tonight. Wang Haoyu reassures her, saying he'll ask his brother Wang Dahai to deal with Su-chun for her. Jiang Shaoqian thinks that Wang Haoyu isn't really that bad after all. Plus, he has his influential brother. He's definitely better than that loser. Just then, Su-chun appears, mocking her for throwing herself at anyone. She's startled and asks what he's doing there. Wang Haoyu points at him and tells his brother it was Su-chun who hit him. Wang Dahai said he didn't expect it to be Su-chun who dared to touch his little brother, and Wang Haoyu asked if he know him. Wang Dahai explains that Su-chun borrowed 600,000 yuan from him and has to pay it back by tomorrow. Wang Haoyu says that's perfect. They can settle these two things. Jiang Shaoqian is now happily saying she really got rid of a loser, especially one who owes money to brother Dahai. Su-chun says it really is impossible to have a good meal in that place. Wang Dahai reminds him that the payment date is tomorrow. Why is he here in his hotel acting like everything's fine? Wang Haoyu shouts at his brother not to even talk to this guy since he hit him. Lu Xinrui then appears and asks what's going on and if they can resolve it. Wang Dahai says if she forces Su-chun to kneel down and apologize, they can let it slide for today. She then asks Su-chun what's going on. He says it's just some pests bothering him. Wang Dahai smacks the table, saying he was only calm because the payment is due tomorrow. From afar, a guy with a goatee beard asks what's going on and who let him cause trouble here. Su-chun and Wang Dahai recognize this guy as Gao Chong. Wang Dahai starts apologizing and asking what he's doing here. Gao Chong says he has important matters to discuss here today, and it's not for him to cause trouble. Wang Dahai knows Gao Chong is an entrepreneur involved in various underground activities and has a lot of people under his command. It's really not good to go against him. With that, Wang Dahai apologizes, saying he'll come back later. Su-chun recognizes Gao Chong, also known as Skull Crasher. In the apocalypse, Gao Chong became one of the most powerful forces and even had the Hell Chef working for him. Su-chun remembers that this hotel was one of the first places where some people with powers appeared. Maybe Gao Chong got so strong because of something that will happen here. Gao Chong stares at Su-chun, while Su-chun thinks that whatever opportunity arises in this hotel, he'll seize it. Gao Chong notices Su-chun's intense glare at him. Sometime later, Gao Chong takes Duanya to meet a mysterious man named Mr. Sun, Curios. She asks, "What does this guy want to discuss with me?" Mr. Sun, with a wide smile, replies, "I've been looking forward to meeting the wonderful Miss Duan." and serves her a drink. Duanya's eyes are fixing on the glass suspiciously, realizing it probably contains something more than just wine. Meanwhile, Su-chan is having flashbacks to his past life when he hid in a basement with Jiang Shaoqian, barely surviving. He never imagined that in this life, he'd kick her to the curb and she'd still follow him. But hey, it's the perfect opportunity for revenge. Looking over at the pool, Su-chan sees the two brothers trying to cool off, complaining about the unusually hot night, but consoling themselves with the thought that bikinis would soon appear. They gaze up at the moon, commenting on how strangely bright it is, almost like the sun decided to pull a night shift. Just then, Wang Haoyu, in a fit of romantic fervor, declares his love for Jiang Shaoqian, while Su-chan, now in his room, raises a glass to the moon, welcoming the apocalypse with a smirk. Suddenly, the moon starts to rumble and blaze, shooting death rays of light. Everyone outside feels a searing pain in their skin and starts running back to the hotel, screaming, "Why is the moonlight burning us?" Inside the hotel, people are bewildered. It's night, but it's as bright as day. The three of them are sprinting, their skin reddening like lobsters in a pot. Desperate for relief, they spot an aquarium, knock it over, and dive in. Wang Dahai's henchmen, utterly confused, ask, "What's going on, and where is Brother Dahai?" At that moment, Wang Haoyu remembers his brother, who staggers in, looking like he just auditioned for a horror movie with his burnt skin. Meanwhile, in the room, Mr. Sun is perplexed, asking Duanya why she isn't drinking. Gao Chang tries to salvage the situation, suggesting they join the banquet. But Mr. Sun, with a menacing grin, insists, "In this city, nobody refuses the wine I pour." Duanya fumes, realizing Gao Chang set her up, eager to climb the social ladder by handing her over to this shady character. She knows Sun Dibiao's notorious reputation and is certain the wine is spiked. As the moon's death rays intensify, the three of them hurriedly close the curtains, pondering what on earth is happening. Mr. Sun suggests they go downstairs to get a better understanding, and Duanya, seizing the chance to escape, eagerly agrees. In the lobby, Lu Xinrui tries to calm the panicked crowd, assuring them that rescue teams must be on their way. Gao Chang, seeking answers, asks a henchman for an update. The henchman reports that the moon turned red and the temperature soared over 70 degrees. The news says many people are injured or burned. Mr. Sun frantically calls the minister, requesting a pickup, but later informs Gao Chang that there's a slight issue. They're not coming. Meanwhile, Wang Dahai is writhing in pain, his skin thoroughly scorched. People try applying burn ointments, but it's like using a band-aid on a bullet wound. He needs a hospital, but stepping outside is like walking into an oven. Desperate, he calls Xiao Dao, one of his henchmen, to pick him up. Xiao Dao answers the call from the underground parking lot, and initially agreeable, he rolls outside and realizes it's hotter than a sauna. His car tires burst, and he abandons the vehicle, calling Wang Dahai to say with this crazy weather he will go back. So Wang Dahai and the other can figure it out themselves. Running through the blistering heat, Xiao Dao's shoes melt, causing him to slip and fall. He looks around, horrified to see a nearby body already turned into a crispy critter. Panicking, he tries to stand, not noticing that half his face is now part of the asphalt. Back at the hotel, everyone is on edge as they hear his scream over the phone. Amidst all this chaos, our protagonist, Su-chun, enjoys the luxury of a temperature-controlled room, sleeping soundly and blissfully unaware of the fiery mayhem outside. The government has issued urgent announcements in response to the intense heat emitted by the moon. Temperatures have soared by over 75 degrees, with ground temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. This unprecedented event has already resulted in hundreds of casualties. Residents are advised to stay indoors to avoid severe skin and respiratory burns. During this chaos, one of the power plants explodes due to the excessive heat, cutting off some communications. Wang Dahai loses contact with Xiao Dao, and everyone is gathered in the last remaining room of the hotel. Jiang Shaoqian and Lina complain about being in a room full of men. Suddenly, the power goes out, and with it, the air conditioning. As the heat becomes unbearable, everyone starts taking off their shirts in desperation. Jiang Shaoqian remembers that Su-chun's room has a pool. Meanwhile, our protagonist, Su-chun, is swimming peacefully. He had anticipated the power outage due to the explosion at the power plants, which is why he chose a room with a pool. Additionally, his room has vertical air conditioners and giant batteries to maintain the temperature. However, he's missing some ice. Changing his position, he sits on the sofa, feeling content. Hungry, he sets up a banquet on the table, thinking that a small breakfast is needed on the first day of the apocalypse. He wonders when Gao Chang will gain power. Just then, someone knocks on the door, claiming to know he's inside. Su Chun, confident in his teleportation ability and preparations, decides to open the door. As the door opens, a cold breeze flows out, bringing indescribable relief to everyone outside. They marvel at the air conditioning and comfort inside. Su Chun asks if they need anything. Wang Haoyu points out the ice, pool, food, and electricity in Su Chen's room. Lina and Jiang Shaoqian angrily demanded to know how he could let them suffer outside while he lived in luxury. They insist he vacate the room. Wang Dahai steps into the room, but Su Chun shoots him in the stomach. Shocked, Wang Dahai sees the wound as Su Chun warns him that another step will be his last. Trembling, everyone wonders if Su Chun really has a gun. Another shot rings out, and Wang Dahai falls with a leg wound. Su Chun points outside, giving everyone 3 seconds to leave before he starts shooting again. Gao Chang talks to Lu Xinrui, questioning how such a large hotel could lack food. She apologizes, explaining that they recently hosted a banquet for over 1,000 people, and the food deliveries were scheduled for today. Meanwhile, Mr. Sun, drenched in water, commands Lu Xinrui to bring all available water and food. Families, outraged by his water waste, start a fight in the lobby. Injured, Wang Dahai arrives and warns everyone that Su Chun shot someone. Gao Chang, seeing the wound, realizes there might be a tough guy upstairs. Jiang Shaoqian informs everyone that Su Chen's room has electricity, air conditioning, and even a pool. Skeptical but desperate, people surround her, asking for confirmation. She assures them that Su Chun has plenty of ice and food. The crowd decides to head to his room, with Gao Chang sending a henchman to check it out. Once again, Su Chun opens the door, and everyone feels the refreshing cool air. The crowd pleads for his kindness, asking him to care for the elderly and share his resources. A chubby boy spots fried chicken and leaps to grab it, only to be kicked in the belly by Su Chun. Furious, the parents accuse Su Chun of being a murderer. As people start to enter his room, Su Chun shoots a man in the back, who falls to the ground. Su Chun warns that while he may be alone, everyone there has only one life. Su Chun knew the situation was dangerous, but at any moment, he could jump through the portal and disappear. Downstairs, Wang Haoyu is furious after his brother suffered 2 gunshot wounds. A crowd threw his body out because he was already dying and decomposing. Wang Haoyu insists they have to kill that damn Su Chun. Meanwhile, in front of Su Chen's room, Jiang Shaoqian and Lina are sweating and dripping with heat, pleading to come in. They assure Su Chun that he wouldn't have the courage to shoot them and profess their love, promising to join him in an adventure all night long if he lets them stay. Su Chun, amused by their eagerness, decides to let them in. They are all happy and disbelieving but are suddenly interrupted by Wang Haoyu, who barges in, hitting them and declaring his intent to kill Su Chun. As he is about to touch Su Chun, he takes a blow to the face from Su Chen's stick, causing everyone to fall to the ground. Wang Haoyu, beaten and in their arms, is afraid to enter the room. Su Chun tells them to get lost, and they leave, realizing he was just playing with them. Su Chun warns that if anyone tries anything, the artillery robot he has installed will shoot everything out in seconds. An armored vehicle is seen outside the hotel, and everyone believes it is the rescue team. The soldiers, armed with rifles and wearing protective clothing, enter the hotel and ask for someone named Lu Xinghua. Upon identifying himself, Lu Xinghua is told to put on an insulation suit and come with them. Everyone asks to be rescued together, but the soldier assures them to stay calm. The rescue operation will take place tonight at midnight in Silicon Valley Square. The residents celebrate, feeling reassured that the government hasn't abandoned them. Mr. Sun offers to pay $1 billion if they take him now, but he is restrained by one of the soldiers, who tells him not to interfere with the operation. Mr. Sun urges Gao Chang to do something, but with so many guns aimed at him, there's no way. Zhang Xiaoqian grabs one of the soldiers and informs him of a killer living upstairs, with Lena adding that he's already killed several people and will soon finish everyone here. They plead for the soldiers to save the people in the hotel. A soldier named Xiaofeng decides to investigate and is cautioned by his friend to be careful and not act impulsively. Xiaofeng takes his gun and starts climbing the stairs towards Su Chen's room. Zhang Xiaoqian thinks this is the perfect situation to steal the room for herself after Xiaofeng kills Su Chen. Xiaofeng cautiously walks down the hallway, observing every corner until he notices a camera watching him. Suddenly, Su Chen opens the door and throws a flashbang, blinding Xiaofeng. A tear gas grenade falls at his feet, and as he's coughing, Su Chen appears from behind and hits him on the head. Sometime later, Xiaofeng wakes up in Su Chen's room, not understanding what's happening and why it's so cold. Su Chen tells him that his name is Lu Xiaofeng and that he's a captain of the Special Forces. Now that he's awake, Su Chen wants to talk. Xiaofeng, looking around at the ice cubes, asks what's going on and where Su Chen got those grenades and weapons. Su Chen says he's just a regular guy who recently graduated and acquired the weapons on a trip to the Middle East. Su Chen then asks if the government has set the rescue points for tomorrow morning, surprising Xiaofeng with his knowledge. Su Chen realizes everything is going to be the same as in his past life and warns Xiaofeng that even though the temperature is lower at midnight, people can't stand more than 10 minutes outside. The majority will die just trying to reach the rescue point. Xiaofeng argues that they have no choice since many people are starving in their homes and can't stand the heat anymore. Their only chance is to reach the rescue point, but modifying the vehicles in time to rescue everyone indoors is impossible. At least if they put blankets over their heads, they might make it. Su Chen places his hand on Xiaofeng's shoulder and points a gun at him. Xiaofeng asks him to calm down and at least let him warn everyone to use blankets. Su Chen cuts the rope binding Xiaofeng, telling him he's free and that he respects his efforts to save lives, but warns him not to come back. Xiaofeng asks if Su Chen isn't afraid he'll return with others, but Su Chen shows him a camera with facial recognition and an automatic machine gun, saying there's no need to be afraid. Xiaofeng recognizes the setup and leaves, acknowledging the warning. Returning to the armored vehicle, Mr. Sun is angry that not even a soldier could deal with Su Chen. He hits Gao Chang, saying he really can't do anything. Gao Chang's henchmen ask if they will tolerate this. Gao Chang explains that after everyone is rescued, they will still need connections, so it's dangerous to act now. At that moment, Su Chen appears and mocks them for dreaming of restoring order during chaos. One of Gao Chang's henchmen gets angry, but Gao Chang tells him to calm down and asks why Su Chen came downstairs. Su Chen then shows a bucket of ice, saying he came to negotiate. The henchman tells Gao Chang it's good to kill that kid now and take everything he has in the room, but Su Chen points the gun at him, and the guy gives up the idea. Gao Chang then says they should talk business, and he hands over the edible ice to both of them. When they eat it, they're impressed with how delicious it is. Gao Chang now also wants to kill Su Chen to take everything he has, but first, they'll meet his demands. At that moment, Mr. Sun kicks him in the stomach, saying he's a damn liar for hiding those ice cubes, and starts stepping on him, saying if he hides anything else, he'll die. Gao Chang is losing it, and Mr. Sun sees Duanya sitting, saying she's a very modest girl. Everyone is about to die of heat, and she hasn't even had the courage to take off her clothes. But he grabs her arm, saying he's tired of seeing her attitude, and he's in the mood to do certain things, so she better follow him. Duan slaps him in the face, calling him a bastard. But suddenly Sun Debiao rips her shirt, saying for her disobedience he'll take advantage first, and then everyone will do what they want. She falls to the ground scared, and he says she's sweating a lot, and he's just doing her a favor. Until Gao Chang appears behind him, saying enough of this. Sun Debiao turns to say something, but Gao Chang punches him in the neck with a closed hand, breaking it instantly. He falls to the ground dead, and Gao Chang says Su Chen is right. Indeed, this place is already chaos, and people like him have to die with it. He then warns that this place is now under his control. Whoever doesn't want to obey will go to the rescue point or die here. Upstairs, Su Chen observes, saying that apparently his words were effective. Gao Chang was already the boss of this place in the past life, so we just sped things up, and with that the two of them have already been thrown out. Gao Chang then starts drinking the ice Su Chen gave him, while Zhang Xiaoqian and Lena beg for a little peace, saying they'll do whatever he wants. He throws it to them, saying it's okay. They'll give them some, but they better obey any demand. His henchman asks if they're not going to the rescue point, and Gao Chang says it's too far. It's not certain they'll survive. The henchman asks why he wants these women if they're running out of resources. Gao Chang says it's all part of a plan to deal with Su Chun. At midnight, Lina and Zhang Xiaoqian try to leave covering themselves with blankets, but the henchman comes and takes everything off them. Zhang Xiaoqian asks what he thinks he's doing, but the henchman warns that now that they've taken the ice, they'll have to stay with him for a while. Those who decided not to obey Gao Chang because he didn't provide supplies or water are trying to reach the rescue point, but even though it's midnight, the ground is much hotter than they imagined. They're trying to protect their feet with a piece of wood, but it makes it difficult to walk and one of them stumbles. Upon contact with the ground, their hand and face melt, leaving the survivor behind to die. Meanwhile, Ha's body, which was burning on the ground until now, wakes up with red eyes. From the balcony, Su Qian observes everything, remembering that in the past life, he almost died on this walk. Zhang Xiaoqian and Lina say they can do whatever he wants, but why don't they at least go to the room? The henchman says they're being too shy. There's no need to try to hide. But suddenly the glass shatters, and the two chubby guys who were burned come running after everyone. Wang Haoyu thinks they're zombies and asks if they'll turn too if they're bitten. Gao Chang says they need to figure it out, then grabs him by the neck and throws him to the two creatures. Wang Haoyu's back is burned just by making contact with the creatures, and Su Chun appears with a blade, telling everyone to get out of the way. The henchman can't believe he wants to deal with these monsters, and Gao Chang is eager, thinking that as soon as Su Chun kills the two, he'll kill him and take everything for himself. Su Chun knows that bodies exposed to heat turn into zombies, but they don't share any virus. You could say they're more like drought demons. The difference is that these demons retain some memories from their past life. Su Chun stands still and Sun Debiao passes by him and goes towards Gao Chang. That's because he was killed by him, but Wang Dehai was killed by Su Chun and attacks him. However, seeing this situation, he's sure that the chance for Gao Chang to awaken some power is by killing Sun Debiao. So if he goes in his direction and cuts off Sun Debiao, a purple crystal comes out of the body, and that's a kind of core that can evolve a human body. He grabs the crystal, jumps back, and pushes Wang Dehai towards everyone. With that, he goes up the stairs and tells them to have fun. Gao Chang grabs Wang Haoyu on the ground again and throws him towards the creature. Back in his room, Su Chun says these crystal nuclei are extremely rare. He puts it in a glass and drinks it, since that's the absorption method. The body extracts the energy from the crystal and strengthens itself. His eyes turn red and he starts screaming while all his clothes burn. He falls on the ground on top of an ice block. While in the lobby, the drought demon has destroyed all drinkable water. Now that there's nothing to drink or eat, Lina wants to escape, but the henchman stops her, saying she's not going to run away. At that moment, Lina says they should use Zhang Xiaoqian. She was Su Chin's fiancée, and if they throw her at the door, it's certain he'll open it, and then they can try to steal something from him. The henchman says it's a great idea, and Zhang Xiaoqian says she'll help, but she wants to eat meat first. The henchman says there's no meat since the refrigerators have been off for days. Gao Chang looks at her and asks if she wants meat. Then he has a solution. They restrain Lina, and he warns her if she wants to, she'll have to do it. Zhang Xiaoqian is shocked, asking if he means they're going to eat her meat. While Lina is trembling, Zhang Xiaoqian is going towards her. Lina pleads, saying, "What are you doing? You're not going to do that, are you?" But Zhang Xiaoqian goes to her face and says she just betrayed her by talking about her being Su Chin's fiancée. Since she did that, she deserves it, and she stabs her multiple times. Gao Chang and the henchman are even scared to see how she did that without hesitation. Zhang Xiaoqian is going crazy, saying that when she's full she'll go up and drink Su Chin's blood. The henchman looks at Gao Chang and asks if they're really going to do that. Gao Chang says to call Duanya, "Do it quickly or else they'll dry up." Meanwhile, in the room, Su Chun is jumping around with his new body. Not only is he more resistant to heat, but he's also more agile and strong. At that moment, he sees Duanya at the door, standing at the entrance. She's thinking it's getting crazy down there. She doesn't have a chance of surviving if she stays there, so she has to try her luck and use what's left of her value to get something here. Right at that moment, Su Chun opens the door naked and she gets scared. She screams and he apologizes, saying it was unintentional. He was excited about some news in the room. He then tells her that even though he has resources, it's limited, and decides they just met, and he can't accept her just because she's beautiful, right? He remembers that in the past life she was a very smart woman. Furthermore, she formed a cooperative relationship with Gao Chang. However, even though he had thought about having her around, the atmosphere feels strange now. Duanya then tells him that she's not just a cook, she's also a doctor who has been working as a surgeon for 3 years. She's thinking that his room is extremely well equipped. Not only does it have electricity, but it also has ice and food. She needs to demonstrate her worth to stay here. On the sofa, Suchin acknowledges that being a doctor is indeed a good proposition. However, as she knows, resources are extremely scarce and it's uncertain if they'll survive until tomorrow. Feeling uncertain upon hearing this, she says that as long as he doesn't kick her out of the room, she'll do whatever he wants. Upon hearing this proposal, Suchin immediately states that this is her new home. She feels embarrassed thinking she said it a bit hastily and unintentionally. Suchin warns her that her only choice is to behave. If he catches her planning something behind his back, their relationship will end. Duanya assures him that she understands and will never doubt any of his methods or determination. Suchin then suggests that she can demonstrate her determination by undressing. She feels embarrassed and asks him, "Now is it the time to start?" The scene shifted to where Duanya was taking a shower. She thought that with water, electricity, food, and not having to worry about the weather, that place was simply heaven for anyone. The only problem was that Suchin wasn't exactly a saint. He grabbed her by the chin and said he was going to give her something different to eat. After 7 days of starvation, Duanya opened her mouth, expecting anything she would receive. While she thought she knew very well the direction this was going to take, she was prepared the moment she entered the room. Suchin, just like us, was watching on his phone screen with a mischievous smile and said he wasn't doing that just to spy. It was to prevent her from doing improper things. She then came out of the bathroom wearing heels. Heavens above, thank goodness she's a doctor because I'm sure some hearts stopped. She even asked Suchin if it wasn't too short. He told her to turn around, and she blushed. With that, he analyzed it in an extremely meticulous, clinical way and concluded that it was perfect. Suddenly, someone was knocking on the door asking for help. It seemed to be Gao Chang holding Jiang Shaoqian, but he had big teeth. Duanya said he couldn't open the door since those guys had eaten Lena down there. If they let them in, they might be eaten too. Suchin asked her if they really had eaten someone. Outside, the 3 guys were restraining Jiang Shaoqian while Suchin appeared in the background, telling them not to break people's doors. They looked at Suchin with a bunch of veins on their faces and giant teeth. It seemed like everyone was transforming. What Suchin didn't know was that there was a guy right next to the door. Suddenly, he attacked with a kitchen knife right at Suchin's face, but Suchin easily grabbed the arm and managed to immobilize the guy. Gao Chang and his henchmen were halfway transformed and couldn't believe he dodged that. Suddenly, Jiang Shaoqian broke free from them and ran towards Suchin. She reached out for help, saying he needed to save her, but he grabbed her by the neck. Clearly, she was also transforming. Suchin explained that those who consume human flesh in this new world now transform, so she was no longer human to be saved. Gao Chang said it was the end of the world, so it didn't matter if they were eating someone as long as they could survive. Even immobilized, Jiang Shaoqian said the meat was delicious and her body was filled with energy. She tried to attack Suchin, saying she was eager to taste him, but she received a kick and was ejected from the door of the room to the other side. It broke even the window, and she fell outside the building, but she managed to hold on at the last moment and started climbing, saying that Suchin wouldn't get away so easily. But then she noticed she was getting hit by the scorching sun and started to burn. Suchin was calm with his hand in his pocket while the 3 thugs ran towards him, saying he couldn't be given the chance to pull out a weapon. Calmly, Suchin asked why they thought he would waste bullets. Suddenly, one of them jumped in Suchin's face, saying he was underestimating them too much. The sneaky guy pulled out his pistol and said he likes to waste it, and he hit the guy right in the head. Even though they were monsters, they kept their consciousness, so they came up with a plan to spread out and attack him from all directions. While Suchin finished off one coming from the front, the other thug was already above on the ceiling, warning that not only were they faster but their reaction time was also much better. With one attack from each side, he He took advantage to go over and warned Su Chun that it was the end for him. He was confident that with a punch he would finish the boy and steal everything he had. But Su Chun jumped and caught him halfway, asking if he had finished talking. With that, they both fell, with Su Chun smashing his head on the ground. Another knife came for him, but Su Chun was standing still and easily blocked it. With a single move, he disarmed one of the zombies and took out the other one beside him. Gao Chang took advantage of this opening to try to land a punch, but his neck was also grabbed, and Su Chun slammed him against the wall. That's when something else was coming from the corridor. Even Su Chun seemed to be startled by what he saw. It was Jiang Shaoqian, completely transformed into a drought demon. She jumped from the glass and approached Su Chun. He recognized her and called her by her name. Seeing the transformation, he said she transformed too quickly, so apparently her dependencies were deep. As he finished off Gao Chang, he said that since she wouldn't disappear, he would finish her off again. With that, Gao Chang was lifeless. Transformed Jiang Shaoqian let out a monstrous scream. Inside the room, Duanya was getting impressed. I'm also very impressed with her, god damn it. She said that Su Chun was too incredible. He was dealing with the entire Gao Chang's gang alone. But seeing that creature in the corridor, she knew that was much more dangerous than the others. She knew that if she wanted to stay by his side for a long time, she couldn't be a burden to him. So she called Su Chin's name, who turned to see what it was. He was confused by her saying she would help. He said if she didn't get scared and hide, that was already good. But if she came out armed like that, with so much thickness, he would be very distracted in combat. She was kind of confused until she realized she was indeed an impressive doctor. Meanwhile, Jiang Shaoqian was making some noises until she let out a big scream and jumped towards Su Chen with her mouth open. He was surprised and turned to see her coming, but it was too late. He took a blow right on the shoulder. Duanya was startled and called out his name, but at that moment, Su Chun had already activated his berserker power, and her claws only made small scratches. Jiang Shaoqian turned around disbelievingly. In a quick move using her tail, she reached Su Chen's back, and taking advantage that he was immobile, she bit him right on the shoulder. But her teeth couldn't penetrate his skin, which seemed as hard as steel. She couldn't understand what just happened. Su Chen asked if her teeth were just for decoration, but warned that now it was his turn. He grabbed one arm and then the other. He jumped backward to her back, immobilizing her. He pressed his foot on her spine, and with her unable to react, he asked if she was ready. With a crack, he pulled both her arms out while jumping and slamming her on the ground. As Jiang Shaoqian fell to the ground in agony, Su Chun stylishly landed behind her with the toothpicks in his hand, tossing remains away. He said he was planning to make her suffer much more in this apocalypse, but now that she's like this, she forced him to finish her off as quickly as possible. But suddenly, he noticed something. Using her tail, Jiang Shaoqian grabbed one of the bodies on the ground. She opened her monster mouth and started swallowing the guy. Her mouth stretched all the way to the side of her spine, and her body, burning from the inside, easily melted the guy's flesh. With that, he was devoured, and her arm began to regenerate. In a few seconds, all the wounds were healed, and she stared at Su Chen and let out a scream. Even for him, it was a surprise that she could regenerate lost limbs like that. In the room, Duanya was disbelieving. This was completely against medicine, but strangely, Su Chen said it was too good. She was confused, not understanding what he was talking about. Su Chen was celebrating the fact that it wasn't so easy to kill her. This meant he could spend a lot of time tearing each of her pieces apart. In a flash of movement, he lunged towards Jiang Shaoqian. Even transformed, she was unable to defeat him. He suddenly grabbed her shoulder with red eyes and said they would only find out how many times her body could regenerate. Pulling her left arm, he said they would start with that one. From the other side of her ear, he said it was now the turn of the right arm and pulled another one. The monster was agonizing. Tossing the four limbs up, she fell to the ground battered but easily regenerated. As soon as she was back to 100%, Su Chen said the first round was over, but she better get ready because the second was about to begin. From the room, Duanya watched everything, the rain of limbs being thrown everywhere, while Su Chen kept finishing her off. She regenerated once again, and it was time for the third round. He continued removing each of her limbs and the tail. With that came the 4th round, then the 5th round. He began testing removing other parts, and after many experiments, Jiang Shaoqian was on the ground crying while Su Chan said he was already satisfied. He wasn't a demon, but the little humanity left in her made her ask why she was being treated like this. Su Chan didn't like that question, especially because he remembered very well what she did to him in the past when he did everything for her and was stabbed in the back. He then stepped on her, saying it was revenge, and with one step, it was the end of Jiang Shaoqian. Disbelieving and scared of what she saw, Duanya asked if he was okay and if he was sane, but Su Chan ignored her question and only wanted to know if she was ready. Amidst that chaos, she was confused and asked, "Ready for what?" Su Chan approached her from behind and said he had been so heroic. Now shouldn't she reward him? Duanya seemed to agree because she only asked if it would be right there. In another part of the city, at a rescue point, someone mentioned that the temperatures seemed to be normalizing. With open hands, this person wondered if it was the end of the apocalypse when suddenly Xiao Feng appeared, a little embarrassed, calling for the captain. He warned that there was a crowd of survivors approaching the rescue point. The captain took a look. With short hair and carrying 3 giant weapons, she observed what was coming. They weren't survivors but zombies that had already been transformed into drought demons. As soon as the captain noticed this, her pupils contracted. The demons began to run towards them, and she warned to evacuate all civilians from that place. But the zombie crowd seemed endless, and Xiao Feng warned his captain not to die while she was defending the front line. She told him to shut up and get to the rescue point. Meanwhile, Su Chan said now she would experience the power of the Berserker. But Duanya said she already experienced that circuit power many times and asked how many times they had done it. Su Chan warned her that the extreme heat waves would ease off for now, and he wanted to go out to resolve something, so he needed to leave her with unforgettable memories. Timidly and hesitantly, Duanya asked if she couldn't go with him. Su Chan seemed to ignore her question and only said that the people around him first needed to meet 2 conditions. They needed to be valuable and absolutely obey any order. She replied that she understood. Another Berserker adventure begins. That night fell, and Su Chan said Duanya had completely submitted to him. He knew he had to return soon before the great tsunami began. In the past life, the excess of people moving towards the rescue point caused large hordes of zombies that ended up destroying that place. Many civilians and soldiers died in that concentration. Moreover, this caused military weapons to fall into the hands of several people. Suddenly, 3 guys appeared in front of him and told him to stop the car or he would suffer the consequences. From inside, Su Chan seemed unfazed, wondering if that guy was crazy to ask a car to stop like that. With that, he just stepped on the accelerator. The guys were startled and started to run, but Su Chan just accelerated and lightly tapped the guys, sending them flying. Very friendly, our protagonist put the 3 to sleep peacefully on the asphalt. Su Chan knew it would be the same as before. The excessive heat and the wave of zombies caused the collapse of the subway underground as many people ran to the deepest part to escape the heat. Tens of thousands died there. Observing the bottom of the subway, several red eyes stared at him. That's because the sound of the car was attracting everyone. Unfortunately, it wasn't worth hunting power crystals since you would have to look into each of their heads, and with so many down there, it would take too much time. He then decided to take a look at the situation at the school while remembering that he hadn't been to this place since his graduation. The engineering university might have fallen again. When Su Chan stored his car in the dimensional space, he entered a building and came face to face with 2 transformed creatures. They were chained by collars around their necks, and from the back on the sofa, 3 guys seemed calm. The boss said that for Su Chan to enter their territory, he would have to drop that backpack on his back. Su Chan took out a chicken leg from the bottom of the backpack, asking if those guys could help him and offering some of the food. They couldn't believe someone had a chicken leg at a time like this. The boss immediately said he would definitely help him. Just throw those chicken legs. Su Chan smiled and threw the chicken leg right in the middle of the 2 drop demons. Hunger took over, and the 3 guys tried to lunge to compete for the chicken leg, but it was tied by a string. The 3 were startled when Su Chan started pulling. He apologized, stating the 3 did deserve to eat something so good. They grabbed their weapons to finish Su Chan, but Su Chun grabbed his pistol to sort everything out, and 3 loud sounds echoed in that room. Surely it was a very good sleep-inducing weapon, because the 3 boys went into an eternal sleep. While Su Chun couldn't remember so many idiots surviving in the past life, maybe the tips he's given to other people have affected the world more than he thinks. He headed to the reptile and snake laboratory door. Grabbing the padlock on the door, he easily destroyed it, saying apparently not many people came to this place as most of the creatures there had already died. The smell of death filled the place. Looking to the side, Su Chun said he found it. He found the future snake that would be the leader of a snake army, the giant mutated snake monster. Seeing that it had devoured several others, he understood how it survived. In the past life, this was one of the first creatures to undergo atavistic change mutation, which means reverting to an ancestral form. He knew that in a week, a flood would begin, and that's when this monster would transform. If he couldn't prevent it, it would cause a lot of trouble. Seeing that it kept staring at him, Su Chun thought it seemed to have already developed some consciousness. Suddenly, he heard a sound and realized someone was there just behind the door. Armed men prepared to enter, shouting that they knew Su Chun was inside and ordering him to come out now. The protagonist calmly emerged, saying he was at a critical moment and couldn't be disturbed. Suddenly, he noticed a girl with gray hair approaching. The guys seemed to recognize her. Before they could react, she jumped towards them, putting one in a neck hold and another in a leg lock. Before the other guy could react, she fell next to him and climbed onto his back. With a quick hand movement, another one was down. However, someone pointed a gun at her head, saying her moves weren't bad. She quickly reacted, elbowing the person's hand and raising both legs to trap Su Chun. However, when she tried to apply pressure to break his neck, he didn't move, and the guy didn't even react right. He was taking deep breaths. A minute later, he pointed the gun again and asked who she was. Now tied up, if it was just to immobilize, there was no need for all that show. But it seemed he tied her up for something more. She introduced herself as Bai Chong from the Special Operations Team, advising Su Chun to behave himself and let her go. Ignoring what she said, Su Chun asked if she knew Xiao Feng, also from the Special Forces. She was surprised that he knew the guy. Su Chun said, he once saved that kid's life. While he's cooking a delicious rare medium steak, Su Chun said he understood everything. It seemed a group of fugitives took control of the school and were using several people as hostages. Bai Chong said it all happened very quickly when Xiao Feng was rescuing some prisoners. Calmly eating his meat, Su Chun said that if that was the case, it wasn't her fault. She said that now with these powers, those people were nothing to fear. However, she wanted to know when she would be freed from these ropes. Strangely, Su Chun said he would only release her if she promised not to clamp his head with her leg again. She agreed to do it if he gave her a piece of meat. Sometime later, the rope was cut. Su Chun handed her a weapon, saying there was a lot to resolve, so he couldn't help for now. He told her to leave and stop being a pain. However, Bai Chong said she would attack the guy's base. Without the resources they stole, the survivors wouldn't have anything to eat. She insisted, saying this might be the last time they saw each other. Hearing that the guys had several supplies, Su Chun told her to wait. He went through his bag and pulled out an Arctic Warfare Magnum sniper rifle, saying that Xiao Feng was her brother, so he would be a little help. Meanwhile, in the administrative block of the school, in a room, there were several armed guys, and another with 2 Barbies on his lap. He asked how things were going. One of the henchmen said everyone was waiting outside. This time, they would be able to finish off all the students. The boss said that was good to hear, and told them to put those who disobey on the front line so they die quickly. Suddenly, the door was kicked in, everyone was startled, and Su Chun appeared, apologizing for interrupting the meeting. One of the henchmen asked how he got there when there were more than 20 guards in the building. Su Chun said he would calmly explain how he got in. He pointed his finger at one of the guys and said, "Bang!" The guy's head exploded. Everyone in the room was shocked, wondering how it was possible for someone to kill another person just by pointing a finger. Su Chun continued pointing at everyone and warned that anyone who moved would die. The boss angrily told him to shut up. However, from somewhere else, a person with a sniper rifle said the target had been eliminated. It was Bai Chong from the top of a building with the AWM, but she was insecure, as Su Chan was alone there. and there were a lot of dangerous people in that place. For her, this plan of his to go alone was very risky. However, when Su-chun handed over the weapon, these were exactly the orders he gave. She wondered how she had the courage to trust something so foolish. Suddenly, when she aimed, the curtains were closed. She screamed to Su-chun, asking what was happening and why the curtains were closed. She heard that the people in the room seemed to have figured out it was a sniper doing the job. She ran out, now sure that her location had been discovered. She ran down the stairs, hoping Su-chun was okay, running desperately while hearing in her earpiece that they were sending people to kill him. The poor girl was almost losing her mind. She burst through the door, saying she was there for revenge. However, the henchmen were all on the ground. Su-chun was holding the boss by the neck. He warned that there were no supplies there. After finishing off all the gang members, Su-chun stored the supplies in his dimensional space. While holding the gang leader's neck with one hand, Su-chun extended his other hand to the side and closed his dimensional space. The gang leader panicked and started sweating, knowing his death was near. With a fearful look, he tried to persuade Su-chun by explaining that if he killed him now, his superiors wouldn't let him escape, and eventually, they would end up killing him. Just before he could finish speaking, Su-chun snapped his neck, ending his life. He began to look at the gang leader's corpse and, with a smile, reassured him not to worry because his superiors were also going to come see him very soon. Bai Chong entered the building and, upon seeing what was in front of her, she was shocked. With a surprised look, she started looking around and asked Su-chun if he had been the one who had done all this. Su-chun turned his head slightly towards her and, with a smile, explained that he had only been exercising all this time. He also added that there were no more supplies here, which meant they must have run out of strength from hunger a long time ago. Upon hearing this, she became somewhat confused. She started staring at Su-chun and asked if someone else could charge them now that they had run out of resources. She didn't know what the students were going to do. Su-chun remained silent for several seconds and began to look at her with a serious gaze. If necessary, he was willing to share some of the supplies he had just stored in his space, but this would depend entirely on their behavior. He decided to stop thinking about the matter, put his hand in his pants pocket, turned his back to her, and started heading towards the exit. He asked her to follow him as it was time to go to the girls' dormitory. Upon hearing this, she was somewhat surprised. She slightly turned her head back, and while watching Su-chun gradually move away, she asked him why he wanted to go to the girls' dormitory. He left the room, put both hands in his pants pockets, slightly turned his head towards her, and explained that he had just asked Xiao Feng to gather the other students there. Bai Chong grabbed the sniper rifle and also left the room. While holding on to the sniper's rope with one hand, she placed her other hand on the door, turned her head towards him, and upon learning that everyone was gathered in the girls' dormitory, she became even more surprised. In the room, there were some corpses tied up and hanging from the ceiling. Amongst them was a woman who, unlike the others, was still alive and had heard their entire conversation. Upon seeing that Su-chun had supplies, with a murderous look, she decided to do something about it. Several hours later, a gray-haired man wearing a metal mask began approaching the administrative building. He was looking for a girl who had fled and caused trouble again. He entered the building and, with a surprised look, he began to wonder if she had died this time. Upon entering the room, one of his subordinates informed him that the captain was still alive. While the man had his hands in his pants pockets, he looked up at the ceiling and saw the woman tied and hanging from it. He began to walk towards her and thought that this was a pity. One of the man's subordinates started running to bring down the hanging woman. Upon searching a bit, the man found a rope. He quickly grabbed the rope with both hands and began to lower the woman. The woman fell to the ground, placed one hand on the arm of the sofa, and slowly started getting up. The man approached her and addressed her as Sister Jia, saying she had pretended to be a prisoner and had been hanging here for several days. So he asked her if she had found the sensation she was looking for. She began to look down at the ground, addressed the man as Steel Fangs, and told him that she had had a close encounter with death, so she needed his comfort. Upon hearing this, he took out a whip, held the handle with one hand and the rope with the other, then turned his body towards her. He stared at her intently and asked if she was sure. She sat on the ground, turned her back to him, and prepared herself to receive the lash. Upon seeing that she was ready, he gave her a strong whip on the back, causing her intense pain and making her start screaming. He began to look at Jia and couldn't help but smile. He asked her how she was feeling now. Far from feeling pain, she had enjoyed the lash. She put her hands on her cheeks, closed her eyes, stuck out her tongue, and replied to him that now she felt much better. The man sat on the couch and placed Jia on his lap. While he had one hand resting on his knee, he placed the other on her waist, turned his head slightly towards her, and upon remembering that she had seen everything, asked her who was the one who had stolen his supplies. She put her arm around his neck, rested the other arm on the couch, lifted her head, closed her eyes, stuck out her tongue, and explained to him that the one responsible for this was a demon. Upon hearing this, he turned his head towards her and with a smile asked her to tell him the name of that demon since he was going to make him pay. Jia turned her head slightly towards him and with a serious look revealed to him that the person who had stolen the supplies was Su Chun. At the same time, Su Chun and Bai Chong arrived at the girls' dormitory. Upon entering, she asked Xiao Feng why he was injured. He addressed her as the team captain and reassured her not to worry because he was fine. He also added that it was great to see that she had returned. Xiao Feng was injured and had bandages on his abdomen. While he had one hand over the bandages, he began to stare at Su Chun and asked him what he was doing here. Upon hearing this, Bai Chong turned her body towards Su Chun and, with a serious look, she explained to Xiao Feng that Su Chun had said he was his savior. Su Chun turned his head towards him, started pointing at him, and upon seeing that he was badly injured, asked him to allow him to examine the wound. Xiao Feng removed the bandages, and a claw mark could be seen. He explained to him that in reality, this had only been a normal scratch, but somehow the injury was becoming more serious. Su Chun placed his hand under his chin, began to look at his wound, and revealed to him that the culprits were the glutton creatures that fed on humans, carrying bacteria and viruses under their nails, representing a deadly risk without medical intervention. Upon hearing this, with a lost look in his eyes, Xiao Feng started looking towards the ground and explained to him that now medicines were scarce resources and could not be found at all. Despite knowing this, he was not willing to die like this. Just before he could finish speaking, Su Chun threw him some medication. He quickly grabbed the medication and couldn't help but be shocked. Seeing so many medications, both he and Bai Chong were in shock. She quickly turned her head towards him and asked where he had gotten so many medications from. While Su Chun was holding the backpack, he slightly turned his head towards her and calmly reminded her once again that he was Xiao Feng's savior. In his previous life's official organization, there was a man whose combat power was comparable to a human-shaped nuclear bomb and was known as the God of Strikes. If this person were Xiao Feng, then Su Chun's investment would not be in vain. With a serious look, Xiao Feng told him that now he owed him a favor. He knew that he definitely hadn't come here specifically to deliver the medicine to him, so he asked why he had come here. At that moment, Su Chun asked everyone to evacuate immediately as the big flood was approaching. Upon hearing this, both Xiao Feng and Bai Chong were somewhat confused. Su Chun explained to everyone that the extremely high temperatures had caused a rapid melting of the glaciers, resulting in the intrusion of seawater. Consequently, the entire school was going to be flooded. One of the girls who was in the girls' dormitory took a step forward, placed her hand on her chest, and began to stare at Su Chun. She asked the others not to believe his nonsense. She asked him where the great flood he was talking about was. She believed that he only wanted to drive them all away in order to monopolize the school's resources. Upon hearing this, Su Chun simply started looking at the girl and remained silent. She was Fang Qing, his classmate, a wealthy heir, and a famous female fighter at Technical University who enjoyed creating conflicts between men and women. While Fang Qing had her hand on her chest, she noticed that Su Chun was holding a backpack. Upon seeing this, she immediately asked him if there was something to eat inside. He refused to answer her question, and upon seeing this, she tried to take his backpack away from him, but unfortunately for her, he was not willing to let someone like her see what the backpack contained. In the blink of an eye, Su Chun stored the backpack in the dimensional space and slapped Fang Qing hard. As a result, her cheek swelled up, and she broke a tooth. She put a hand on her cheek, picked up the tooth with the other hand, and asked him how dare he hit her. The students who were nearby couldn't help but praise Su Chun, as Fang Qing had been causing a commotion in the dormitories. Furthermore, she occupied a dormitory all by herself, and because of this, she had been despised for a long time. Having money from her family was useless now. Everyone wanted her to leave. Su Chun slightly turned his head to the side, and upon hearing this, he realized that she wasn't very popular around here. In a matter of seconds, Fang Qing lost her composure. She started screaming and asked them how their miserable lowlifes dared to do this to her. She also added that she was going to go to her father and tell him to kill them all. After saying this, she turned her back on Su Chun and started to walk away from him. Seeing her behavior, Bai Cheng turned her body towards her and, while watching how she was slowly moving away, she asked Su Chun if it was good to let her go. He took the backpack out of the dimensional space again, put it on his back, slightly turned his head towards her, and told her that it didn't make sense to stop her since she was looking for her father. Several minutes later, Fang Qing came out of the girls' dormitories and thought that all men in this country were worthless, especially Su Chun. There was no comparison with foreign gentlemen. While she was lost in her thoughts, someone began to approach her from behind. This person was Steel Fangs. He quickly covered her mouth, called her baby, and with a smile asked her where Su Chun was. Upon hearing this, she started trembling and couldn't help but feel afraid. Several minutes later, Su Chun also left the dormitories. Bai Cheng and Xiao Feng approached the exit and began waving goodbye to him. He put his hand in his pants pocket and, with a serious look, decided to let Bai Cheng take care of the evacuation. He took out his phone and thought that the most important thing now was to harvest the Snake King once it mutated. He didn't know if he could obtain the ability to control water. While Su Chun was lost in his thoughts, a truck approached the area, and someone started asking him for help. He began to follow the trail of the voice, and as he turned a corner, he saw that this voice belonged to Fang Qing. Steel Fangs had captured her and tied her to a crane. Su Chun approached her, started staring at her, and mocked her by asking if she had found her father. Upon hearing this, she started looking down at the ground again and asked for help once more. Steel Fangs climbed onto the truck, extended his hands to the sides, started looking at Su Chun, and introduced himself as Steel Fangs from the evolution base. After saying this, he put one foot on top of the crane, rested his elbow on his knee, placed his other hand on his waist, stared at Su Chun, and with a smile asked him how dare he steal their supplies. He had thought that Su Chun was a man with 3 heads and 6 arms. With a serious look, Su Chun began to stare at Steel Fangs and asked him if he really was from the evolution base. Steel Fangs started hitting the roof of the truck, turned his head towards Su Chun, and with a smile replied, "Correct." He also added that for this meeting, he had prepared a special gift for him. At that moment, the back door of the truck began to open. Inside the truck, there were several dozen zombies. Steel Fangs extended his hand to the side, and with a smile asked Su Chun if he was ready to die. Su Chun simply put his hands in his pants pockets and stood still in silence. Bai Cheng and Xiao Feng entered the girls' dormitory again, and shortly after, they began to hear a loud noise coming from outside. She turned her head to the side and, with a serious look, told him that the sound was coming from the same direction Su Chun had gone. Upon hearing this, Xiao Feng's expression changed drastically. With a worried look, he started wondering what was happening. Bai Cheng knew something bad was happening, so she decided to take a look first. She turned her head slightly towards Xiao Feng, started looking into his eyes, and asked him to stay here, watching over and protecting the others. Xiao Feng wasn't willing to let her go alone. Since the outside was full of dangers, with a serious look, he refused and told her that he also wanted to go with her. At the same time outside, all the zombies got out of the truck and started moving towards Su Chun. Steel Fangs couldn't help but burst into laughter, while Su Chun simply put his hands in his pants pockets and remained silent. While Steel Fangs had his foot resting on the crane, he placed his elbow on his knee, put his other hand on his waist, stared at Su Chun intently, and asked if Fang Qing was his classmate. He decided to give him a chance to be the hero and rescue her. With a smile, he told Su Chun that if he wanted to save his classmate, then he had to kneel before him and beg. Upon hearing this, Fang Qing was somewhat surprised and thought there was still hope of surviving this situation. While Su Chun had one hand in his pants pocket, He placed the other under his chin, started looking at the ground, and thought that saving her was not impossible. Upon hearing this, Fong Qing turned her head towards him and couldn't help but feel happy and relieved. She asked him to kneel before Steel Fangs as soon as possible and save her. With a calm look, Su Chun began to stare into Fong Qing's eyes and explained that there was a problem. Upon hearing this, she became somewhat confused and disappointed. At the same time, she asked what the problem was and if he wasn't going to save her. She reminded him that he had just clearly said that he would save her. Su Chun simply remained silent, and in a matter of seconds, she lost her composure. She started staring at Su Chun and couldn't help but explode in anger. Since he was the one who had said he would save her, she asked him how he could change his mind so quickly and also if he still considered himself a man, adding that it was the duty of gentlemen to save ladies. With a murderous look, Su Chun responded to her that he indeed was a man but didn't deserve to save her. After saying this, he mocked her by asking if she wanted him to help her contact the gentlemen living abroad and see if they were willing to save someone like her. Fong Qing became even more furious and soon realized that Su Chun was getting back at her for telling him he was wrong in front of everyone in the girls' dormitory. She started staring at Su Chun and began shouting, asking him why he was seeking revenge on her for such a small thing. In the blink of an eye, she completely lost her composure, screaming like a banshee and asking him if he thought she would apologize to him and beg humbly for his help. She vented by telling him that reality proved he was a complete loser, adding that she didn't need the help of a loser like him. Su Chun couldn't help but feel happy. He began to look at her, pointing his finger at her, and with a smile, asked her to remember her own words later. Little by little, the zombies started approaching Fong Qing, who had her arms and body tied to the crane. Upon feeling the presence of the zombies, she slightly turned her head back. At that moment, her expression changed drastically with a look full of fear. She began to wonder what was happening. The zombies approached her and slowly began to devour her, starting with her legs. Due to the pain, she opened her mouth and started screaming in agony. She couldn't help but ask for help and regret mocking Su Chun. Steel Fangs stared at Su Chun intently, pointing his finger at him. Seeing that he was a person who didn't help others in times of danger, Steel Fangs thought he was a very interesting person. He decided to stop thinking about it since soon Su Chun would end up like her anyway. He decided it was time to show him the technology of their evolution base. With a crazy look, he took out a jar of powder from his pocket, removed the cap, and began to paint his face with the powder. He explained to Su Chun that if one applied this powder on their body, then the monsters would obey and treat them as one of their own. Su Chun wasn't even slightly surprised. With a calm look, he asked Steel Fangs if applying ashes on the body could really make the monsters believe that one belonged to the same species as them. Upon hearing that the powder was actually ashes, Steel Fangs brought the jar closer to his face, started staring at the powder, and couldn't help but sweat and panic. Quickly, he put away the jar, turned his back on Su Chun, and began to move away from him, thinking that this was disgusting. He gave the order to all the monsters to attack Su Chun until they tore him apart and made him into pieces. Upon hearing his command, all the monsters gained momentum and began advancing quickly towards Su Chun. He simply put his hands in his pants pockets, turned his head towards them, and stood still without making a single movement. Once the monsters got close enough, Su Chun took his hands out of his pants pockets, extending them to the sides. With a murderous look, he decided it was time to finish them off. At that moment, two swords that he had stored in the dimensional space appeared in his hands. Gaining momentum, he began to advance rapidly towards the monsters, and using his swords, he cut their bodies into pieces. After finishing off several monsters, Su Chun landed on the ground. He supported himself with one knee and one hand on it, dropping a sword in the process, which got stuck in the ground. He extended his other hand towards the sky and, with a killer look, started staring fixedly at the ground, causing the swords to return to the dimensional space. Steel Fangs wiped the dust off his face and, while he was still cleaning his mouth with his hand, he began to turn his head back and ask Su Chun how dare he play with him before dying. Su Chun approached the truck, put his hands in his pants pockets, and started staring at Steel Fangs. Once he turned his body back and saw Su Chun, he couldn't help but be shocked and wonder how he had gotten here. At the same time, Xiaofeng and Bai Chong left the girls' dormitories and began to follow the trail of the monster's sound. Several seconds later, they turned a corner, and upon seeing what was in front of them, they couldn't help but be shocked. Seeing so many monsters, Bai Chong became alert, dropped her arms to the sides, and couldn't help but worry about Su Chun. Xiaofeng was terrified. He began to look at the monsters with a fearful gaze and couldn't help but sweat and feel afraid. He didn't know where so many monsters had come from. In the blink of an eye, the monsters completely devoured Feng Qing's lower body, leaving only her head. The monsters surrounded Su Chun, who was standing in front of the truck. Steel Fangs, who was on top of the roof, extended his hand to the sides and remained silent. When looking more closely, Steel Fangs saw that all the monsters were standing still. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but get angry and ordered them all to attack Su Chun. While Su Chun was wiping his shirt with his hand, he started looking at Steel Fangs and calmly asked him to stop shouting since the monsters wouldn't obey him anymore. Upon hearing this, he was shocked and started looking at Su Chun with a confused look, asking him what he was talking about. The reality was that Su Chun had already finished off all the monsters when he had been fighting against them. He put his hands in his pants pockets, turned his head to the side, and asked Steel Fangs why he was wasting his energy in vain. Upon seeing that all the monsters had been defeated, he couldn't help but be shocked. With a surprised look on his face, he began to wonder what was happening and how this could be possible. At that moment, Su Chun opened a portal. This portal was connected to another portal that appeared behind Steel Fangs. Su Chun entered the portal and appeared behind him. He stared at him intently and explained that originally, he didn't want to mess with the people from the evolution base. Upon hearing Su Chun's voice, his expression changed drastically. With a confused look, he began to wonder what was happening. Su Chun grabbed Steel Fangs by the metal mask with both hands and asked him who had sent him to kill him. Due to fear of what his superiors could do to him, he decided not to reveal anything to Su Chun. Upon seeing this, Su Chun decided that he couldn't let him live. Su Chun tightly grabbed Steel Fang's head with both hands. He couldn't help but sweat in panic. He started looking at Su Chun, asking him what he was trying to do. Su Chun stared into his eyes and couldn't help but smile. Seeing this, it didn't take long for him to realize what Su Chun was about to do. He tried asking him to stop, but his efforts were in vain. At that moment, Su Chun tightly grabbed his head and began to exert force, causing intense pain to Steel Fangs. He couldn't help but scream in agony due to the strength with which Su Chun was pulling his head. Gradually, his head started separating from his body. In the blink of an eye, Su Chun ripped off his head along with his spine. Upon seeing this scene, Bai Chong couldn't help but be terrified and speechless. She was unable to believe that Su Chun had finished off all the monsters in an instant. She remembered that this had happened before and thought that it couldn't be achieved just by exercising. Thinking this, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of monster Su Chun was. While holding Steel Fang's head in one hand, he put the other hand in his pants pocket, turned his head towards Bai Chong, and told her to pay more attention to the people in the girls' dormitory. He also added that it would be great for him to have a competent assistant. At the same time, in the Green City Hotel, Sunray began to enter Su Chun's room where Duanya was sleeping. She started blushing as she was having an erotic dream. Several seconds later, she opened her eyes and called out to Su Chun with her mouth wide open. Still half asleep, she sat up and asked him not to leave her alone. She sat down, placed both hands behind her on the bed, opened her legs, and started looking towards the bed. She couldn't help but blush even more. She had dreamt of Su Chun again. She didn't know why he hadn't returned yet. She turned her head to one side and began searching for Su Chun. At that moment, she remembered his words a few days ago when she was with him. With a serious look on his face, he asked her if she wasn't useful, then what right did she have to stay by his side? With a determined look, she decided to do something about it and not be a burden to Su Chun. She picked up the gun he had left on the table. She wanted to be his right hand and left arm. At that moment, she began to hear a sound. She filled herself with courage, left his apartment, and started searching the other hotel rooms. She grabbed the gun and forcefully opened the door. This apartment was actually an office. Upon closer inspection, she saw that there was no one inside. But this was very strange since the sound clearly came from here. At that moment, she heard the same sound coming from the area behind her. With a frightened expression, she slowly began to turn her head backwards. Upon seeing what had appeared, her expression changed drastically with a surprised and confused look. She started wondering when this had happened. Behind her was a monster which suddenly appeared in front of her. She went into shock and couldn't help but sweat as she wondered what kind of monster it was. Slowly, the monster began to approach her. She didn't let go of the gun, and silently, little by little, she started walking backwards. With a surprised look, she began to wonder when this monster had appeared behind her. After taking several steps back, her backside collided with the edge of the wooden table that was behind her. While sweat was dripping from her face, she slightly turned her head to the side, and upon seeing the wooden table behind her, she panicked and thought that this was not good as now she had no escape. She remembered that she still had the gun. Thinking this, she decided to use it to eliminate the monster. She tightly grabbed the gun and slowly began to lift it, but at that moment, it collided with the chair next to it. Due to how quickly she was moving her hand, the gun fell out of her hand and started rolling across the table. She slowly turned her head back, and upon seeing this, her expression changed drastically. With a terrified look, she thought that there was no escape left. Upon hearing the sound of the gun rolling across the table, the monster, with a penetrating gaze, began to approach her. It opened its mouth, started roaring, and prepared to attack her. Upon seeing this, she thought she was dead. She brought her hands close to her chest, closed her eyes, and prepared herself to receive the monster's attack. But luckily for her, instead of attacking her, it took a strong bite out of the chair next to her. Several seconds later, it stopped biting the chair, turned its head towards her, and began smelling the perfume she was wearing. Upon seeing that the monster had not attacked her, she opened one of her eyes. Upon realizing that it was sniffing her, she began to wonder what was happening and what this monster was doing. Immediately, she placed her hands on the table, spread her legs, and started leaning back to avoid colliding with the monster. It opened its nose and began to smell even more strongly. Duanya turned her head towards it, and upon seeing this, she began to wonder if it had been smelling with its nose the whole time. She came to the conclusion that it couldn't see. Upon seeing this, she thought she had narrowly escaped. At that moment, the monster started following her scent and began getting closer to her. While she still had her legs on the ground, she laid down on the table, turned her head to one side, closed one eye, clenched her teeth tightly, and being so close to the monster, she couldn't help but sweat. Now it was too close to her, which meant it would react to any sound she made. She started thinking about what to do now. The monster opened its mouth and slowly approached Duanya. She climbed onto the table, extending her hand towards the gun. With a hopeful look in her eyes, she thought that as long as she had a weapon, she would be able to defeat the monster. She began reaching for the gun to grab it, but unfortunately for her, it was too far away. Despite this setback, she was not willing to give up. Despite her efforts to extend her arm as much as she could, in the end, she got tired, and her arm hit the table. Upon hearing the sound, the monster began to approach her head. While she had one hand resting on the table, she turned her head to one side, and upon seeing it getting closer, she couldn't help but sweat. With a worried look, she thought that she was dead. At that moment, the monster finally realized that there was a person nearby. While Duanya had her entire body on the table and was reaching out for the gun, she turned her head upwards, and upon seeing that the monster had noticed her presence, she went into shock. She began to look at it with a terrified gaze and thought that this was not good. It opened its mouth and began to approach her quickly, preparing to attack. At that moment, the only thoughts that came to her mind were memories of Su Chun a few days ago. While Su Chun had his hand under his chin and his eyes closed, he explained to her that his resources were limited, so he couldn't just stay with her because she was beautiful. He closed his eyes and explained to her that if she found the crystal that was inside the monster's brain, then she would obtain powers. Su Chun turned his head towards her, and with a serious look, he told her that he didn't want garbage around him. While little by little the monster was getting closer to her, she turned her body towards it, started staring at it aggressively, clenched her teeth tightly, and decided not to be a loser. Just before the monster could attack her, she put her leg in front, stabbing its eye with the heel, causing intense pain. She drove the heel into it with such force that the tip came out through its head. While she had her body leaning on the table, she forcefully drove the heel into the monster's head. Then she started staring at it with a look full of hatred, clenched her teeth tightly, and began moving the heel from side to side to cause even more damage. Several seconds later, she pulled the heel out of the monster's eye, and due to intense pain, it opened its mouth and started screaming in agony. She began to move her foot away from the monster's head, but at that moment, it moved at high speed and grabbed her foot tightly with its hand. Upon seeing this, her expression changed drastically. She started staring disdainfully at the monster and couldn't help but get angry. She didn't know how it was still alive if she had pierced its skull with the heel. She became furious and started repeatedly stabbing the monster in the eye with her heel again, causing it to open its mouth and scream in agony once more. Several seconds later, she pulled her heel out of the monster's eye, causing its body to start falling backwards. In a matter of seconds, it turned its head to one side, and due to the pain, fell to its knees on the ground. Duanya sat at the table, placed both hands on top, and while watching as its body slowly fell to the ground, she simply remained silent. There was a fire axe in the office. She thought it was a shame because if Su-chun had seen her doing this, he would have thought that she wasn't a loser. In a matter of seconds, the monster fell to the ground and lost its life. Duanya grabbed the axe with her hand, rested it on her shoulder, approached it, put her foot on its head, started staring at it with a serious look, and decided to check if it was true that monsters had a crystal core in their brain. That same afternoon, at the engineering university, Bai Chong and Xiao Feng followed Su Chen's order and began organizing the evacuation of the students. Bai Chong specifically contacted her brother Bai Ming to bring his army and join her in protecting the students. Bai Ming put the weapon on his shoulder, began holding the rope with his hand, turned his head towards the girls' dormitory, and with a serious look, remained silent, wondering if they should really listen to this Su Chen guy. Bai Chong, who was holding the weapon with both hands, turned her head towards her brother, and with a serious look on her face, began to wonder what he was doing. At the same time, in the reptile biology laboratory, the snake that Su-chun was very interested in started to mutate. Several hours later, Su-chun went to the laboratory and took the snake out of its cage. It raised its head and started staring at him intently. Su-chun approached the snake with a serious look on his face, deciding to see how far it could mutate. He decided to prepare a large bucket specifically for this purpose. Su-chun filled a large bucket of water and placed it near the table where the snake was. Just before he could make a move, the snake started approaching the bucket of water, sticking out its tongue and looking at its reflection. He quickly realized that it also knew it had to enter the water to complete the mutation. Seeing this, he thought that it had saved him from having to do it himself. The snake began to put its head inside the water bucket, and little by little, its body started to mutate and grow bigger. With a murderous look, it opened its mouth. Now its teeth were much larger and sharper. The snake slowly began to put its entire body inside the bucket. In a matter of seconds, its whole body started to mutate, and the bucket gradually began to break. Su-chun, who was staring at the snake with a surprised look, couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and wonder what was happening. Several seconds later, the snake completely mutated, causing the water cube to explode. Su-chun put his hand near his face and began to wonder what was happening. The snake, which was once just an ordinary snake, had now transformed into a giant water snake. It opened its mouth and started staring at Su-chun while its body was emitting a suffocating and powerful energy. He began to approach the snake. He dropped his arms to the sides, and upon seeing that it had grown so much with just an initial mutation, he couldn't help but feel relieved. Fortunately, he had only given the snake a bucket of water. If a flood came and it entered the water, then it would grow and mutate even more. Su-chun put one hand in his pants pocket and with the other, pull out a sword from his dimensional space. He stared intently at the snake and told it that if it obeyed him, he would consider having it as a pet. The snake knew it had no chance of winning against Su-chun, So just before he could finish speaking, the snake gathered momentum and started heading towards the laboratory window to escape the area. While holding the sword with one hand, he placed his other hand near his face, and upon seeing that the snake was trying to flee, he was somewhat surprised. With a surprised look, he began to watch as it slowly made its way towards the window and didn't take long to come to the conclusion that it had developed intelligence thanks to mutation. The snake decided to escape from the area. It broke the laboratory window, opened its mouth, and with a penetrating gaze, started descending towards the ground. But for its bad luck, Su-chun was not going to let this happen. He gathered momentum, took a leap, went outside through the window, and started following it. Su-chun grabbed the sword with both hands, started staring at the snake intently, clenched his teeth tightly, and began to question if this was what they called snake movement. But it was a pity for him because its speed wasn't fast enough. In the blink of an eye, Su-chun approached it and forcefully stabbed the sword into the snake's body. But to his misfortune, the blade of the sword broke as soon as it made contact with its skin. Su-chun began to look at its scales and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. He approached the broken sword, looked at the blade, and with a confused expression, began to wonder why the snake's scales were so hard. While he was lost in his thoughts, the snake took advantage of this and in the blink of an eye, approached him, opened its mouth, started staring at him intently, and with a murderous look, prepared to attack. Just before the snake could attack, Su-chun moved at high speed and swiftly moved to one side, dodging the attack. In the process, he extended a hand towards the ground, clenched his other fist, and prepared to attack. Now that the sword didn't work against the snake's scales, with a serious look on his face, he decided to kill it using only his fists. The snake turned its head to one side, and upon seeing that Su-chun had dodged the attack, it was shocked and couldn't help but question what was happening. Just before it could make a move, Su-chun delivered a strong punch to its head, causing its body to forcefully collide with the ground, shattering it into pieces in the process. As he was in midair, the snake's body began to coil around Su-chun's body. He turned his head to one side, and upon seeing this, became somewhat confused and started wondering what was happening. Just before he could move away and do something about it, the snake coiled its body around Su-chun's body, trapping him and rendering him immobile. He clenched his teeth tightly, turned his head to the side, started looking at the snake's scales, and with a surprised look, thought that he was trapped. It didn't take long for him to come to the conclusion that this snake was very clever. After wrapping its body around Su-chun's, the snake began to stare at him and move closer. He turned his head to the side, and upon realizing that it was approaching, he simply remained silent and realized that the previous attack had only been a distraction and that its true objective was to make him lose focus in order to trap him. Now that Su-chun couldn't move, the snake approached him, opened its mouth, and prepared to deliver the final blow. As it slowly approached, he simply turned his head to the side and started looking at the ground. At the same time, Bai Chong and her brother finally evacuated all the students. While they were walking in the area, he slightly turned his head back and saw that she was still looking around with a worried look. He asked his sister if something was bothering her, and also if she was worried because she didn't want to leave handsome Su-chun behind. Bai Chong, who had her hand on her waist, turned her head to the side and with a serious look, explained to her brother that no one would take him for a fool if he didn't speak. Bai Ming grabbed the gun's strap with his hand, turned his body towards her, and with a serious look, asked her if she really liked Su-chun so much. He also added that if Su-chun stayed here, then he would be doomed to die. Bai Chong turned her head towards him, and with a serious look, she told him that Su-chun was not going to die. Upon hearing this, he asked her if she was sure. She approached him, started staring at him intently, and explained that the first time she saw Su-chun, she realized he was strong. To her, his deep eyes were mysterious and unfathomable, like those of a monster. She was convinced that they were going to see each other again. At the same time, outside the laboratory where the fight between Su-chun and the mutant snake was taking place, he activated his powers and began reaching out towards it. Just before it could attack him, he grabbed it by the neck and started strangling it. As a result, the snake loosened its grip, releasing Su-chun's body in the process. He began to stare at the snake and asked if it really believed it could catch him this way. He had heard that a snake's nerves were highly developed. Even if their heads were cut off, they could still bite people. He asked what would happen if this didn't happen. Upon hearing this, the snake couldn't help but panic and start sweating. He tightly grabbed it by the neck and with tremendous force began to twist its body from side to side, causing it to collide with the buildings that were around. Due to this, the snake began to lose consciousness. Then, with a serious look, he forcefully struck its body against the ground. In a matter of seconds, it lost its life. Su Chun approached it, put his foot on its lower jaw, grabbed the upper part with his hand, and exerting some force, split its body in half. Several seconds later, Su Chun took a small crystal from the snake's corpse. While his body was emitting a powerful energy, he put one hand in his pants pocket and brought the crystal close to his face with the other. With a serious look, he decided to see what kind of powers it could give him. If extreme heat could destroy human will, then the floods that were about to come would completely destroy human civilization. Several hours later, the sky filled with gray clouds, and it started raining heavily. Everyone was happy and thought that finally, the temperature was going to drop, but what no one expected was for a flood to occur. Despite the fact that city of Shangdu isn't close to the sea, it could not escape from the flood. A huge wave appeared in the city and began to devastate everything in its path, causing panic among the citizens. The engineering university was not located in a high area, so only the administrative building was tall enough to avoid being flooded by water. Meanwhile, Su Chun, who had completely absorbed the crystal core of the snake, took off his shirt and submerged himself in the water. He began to dive and had no doubt that indeed, by absorbing the crystal core of the snake, one could obtain a new supernatural power and thus experience new changes in their body. Now Su Chun had scales on his face, just like the snake, and he was even able to see underwater. He stared at the ground and thought that after coming into contact with water, not only did small scales grow all over his body, but there was also a significant increase in strength. His eyes became more sensitive to light and had a protective membrane in front of them. He began to look at his hand, and since he was underwater at this moment, he couldn't breathe through his mouth or nose. Despite this, he didn't feel any sensation of suffocation. He felt as if he were breathing through his skin. He didn't know if this was a characteristic of the water snake. He started swimming and emerging towards the surface, and although this power didn't allow him to control the water, being able to breathe underwater was also very good, especially now that the whole city was flooded. In a matter of minutes, the water level began to rise and flooded almost half of the buildings. Now only the tallest ones remained. Su Chun emerged from the water, closed his eyes, and thought that the floods were coming from the direction of Hotel Green City. If he tried to go against the current, it wasn't impossible. There was just one problem. The flow of water was so violent that submerged objects were like hidden blades. Su Chun turned his head to one side, started looking up at the sky, wiped his chin with his hand, and came to the conclusion that the volcanic eruption had reached its limits. Cities were too far from the volcano, and the sky was quite clear. But when a large amount of volcanic ash would rise into the air, covering everything and darkening the daytime, they wouldn't be far from winter's end. While the raindrops were falling on Su Chun's face, he thought that in these final days, human civilization was nothing more than a simple joke. They didn't want to be cannon fodder. They just wanted to improve their own strength. Thinking this, he couldn't help but feel furious because in his previous life, after the Great Flood, several powerful forces emerged in the city. The area to the north of the city became a watery zone due to its low terrain and was occupied by a large army of aquatic beings in human form, led by the water serpent and the Queen of Corpses. To the south of the city, monsters in the shape of ogres appeared, a cannibal tribe known as the Glutton Clan. The rats evolved, and the west of the city was under the control of the Rat Army, subordinate to King Rat. Finally, the east of the city, where Hotel Green City's destroyer was located, was dominated by force and violence. In his previous life, he was on the verge of death several times at their hands. With a serious look, he began to gaze off to the side and remembered that in this life, the matter of Gao Chong and the Golden King Snake had already been resolved by him beforehand. To continue being strong, the best way was to obtain the remaining crystal cores. Several minutes later, He went to a higher area that wasn't flooded, placed a hand on his knee, turned his head to the side, and came to the conclusion that there was a large number of members from the cannibal tribe who were divided into different factions. However, the Queen of Corpses was very mysterious when it came to her whereabouts, making it even more difficult now to find her. In his previous life, the Technology University experienced a mouse plague, so King Rat should be there, and as long as he found it in advance, he could obtain the crystal core from it with less effort. Su-chun was sitting on a rock with one arm resting on his leg and the other on his knee. Below him, there was a pile of monsters staring at him, waiting for him to dive into the water. Looking down, he saw that he was surrounded by monsters. Seeing this, he realized that he had relaxed too much. In a matter of hours, the water level rose so much that the only thing left in the lower area of the city was a communication tower. In this tower, there were two men who were holding onto the pole. They were quite confused and amazed as they didn't know how this great flood had occurred. The bald man turned his head back and saw someone approaching them quickly. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but be amazed and informed his brother that someone was swimming towards them in the water. The man beneath him started looking at his brother and asked him not to be so surprised, as at this moment, even if there was someone in the water, it was most likely that they were dead. Several seconds later, the man turned his head back, and upon seeing what his eyes were witnessing, he couldn't help but be shocked. The person approaching them was none other than Su-chun. Upon looking more closely, the man immediately recognized him. It was surprising for them since he hadn't been drowned by the flood yet. He began to look at Su-chun with a surprised look and couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly. If it weren't for the fact that they had been sent to watch over Su-chun, he and his brother wouldn't have encountered the flood. He decided to kick him and forcefully throw him into the water if he dared to approach them. The bald man started looking back and explained to his brother that Su-chun was too fast. As he looked more closely, he saw that there seemed to be something behind him. Seeing this, he couldn't help but get nervous and start sweating. Upon hearing this, his brother began to look at him with a surprised expression and asked him what he was talking about. As he looked more closely, the bald man saw that many monsters were chasing Su-chun. They both didn't know what those monsters were. Despite Su-chun swimming at a very high speed against the current, thanks to the crystal core, the monsters were not far behind as they were also swimming at a very fast pace. Su-chun began swimming towards the communication tower, and upon seeing this, the bald man held on to the pole even tighter and couldn't help but panic. With a serious voice, he warned him not to approach them as they belonged to the evolution base. Su-chun began to stare at the bald man, and upon realizing that they belonged to the evolution base and they had extended their claws so much in this life, he thought he had come across them just in time. He decided to find out what was going on. He took a big leap and started moving towards them. Both of them turned their heads to the side, and upon seeing this, they were shocked as they couldn't believe that he had jumped so high despite being in the water. Su-chun began to approach the bald man, and upon seeing this, his expression changed drastically. With a surprised look, he started wondering what he was planning to do. Su-chun stepped on his face, causing him to tightly clench his teeth and let go of the pole in the process. He began to fall towards the water and couldn't help but scream and ask for help. His brother turned his head downwards, and upon seeing this, he was in shock and started sweating. He wasn't determined to let his brother fall into the water, so without hesitating for a second, he grabbed him by the hand. He held onto the pole tightly with his legs, and while holding onto the pole with one hand, he grabbed his brother's arm with the other. Because the bald man was heavy, he closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked him to hold on to the pole quickly. He started looking at his brother and explained that he couldn't do it because the pole was too far away. Little by little, the man's strength began to fade. He closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked his brother not to worry because he was not going to let go of him. Upon seeing this, the bald man panicked. He started looking at his brother and told him that if he was too heavy, then he could let go of him, since if they continued like this, both would die. But he refused, as he was not willing to give up and let go of him. If they were going to die, then they would do it together. Meanwhile, Su-chun climbed up the communication tower, sat on the railing, placed both hands on his knees, started looking at them, and asked them to tell him all the information they knew about the evolution base. The man who had his eyes closed and was holding his brother's arm refused, as he was not willing to reveal the information to Su-chan. He believed that even if they died, someone else would avenge them. Upon hearing this, Su-chan couldn't help but praise him for being brave and asked him not to blame him. Then, while they were talking, the monsters approached them and began to emerge from the water. One of them reached its hand up and grabbed the bald man's leg. The monster forcefully pulled his leg, causing his brother to let go of his hand, and he fell into the water. While little by little, the bald man was falling into the water, he reached out his hand towards his brother's hand, and with a desperate look, he began to scream and ask for help. Su-chan started to look at his brother with a serious gaze and explained that it was himself who had gotten into trouble, so they couldn't blame him. Upon seeing his brother falling into the water and being surrounded by monsters, he couldn't help but panic. Without hesitating for a second, he also jumped into the water, as he was determined to save him. Both of them fell into the water and submerged. At that moment, a monster opened its mouth and started approaching him. The man opened his eyes, turned his head to one side, and upon seeing this, clenched his teeth tightly and panicked. Upon seeing that the monster was ready to attack, he turned his head to the side, and with a desperate look, thought he was doomed. He closed his eyes and prepared himself for the attack, but at that moment, Su-chan jumped from the communication tower, plunged into the water, and using his sword, ended the monster's life. The man emerged from the water, and the monsters nearby prepared to attack. But Su-chan took out the swords from the dimensional space, started moving at an incredible speed, and in the blink of an eye, began killing all the monsters. Several seconds later, the bald man also emerged from the water and began panting heavily to catch his breath. The other man turned his body to one side, and upon seeing that Su-chan had killed all the monsters, he came to the conclusion that he was too strong. He couldn't help but be amazed and wonder if he was truly human. Su-chan pulled the two brothers out of the water, and all three climbed up to the communication tower. They thanked him and thought that they really owed him a favor now. They decided to tell him everything they knew. In reality, they had been sent from the evolution base to monitor him. The bald man, who had his body leaning against the railing, began to pant heavily and explained to him that the evolution base was at the Technology University, with Chief Liu in charge of the research laboratory as its core. The other man, who also had his body leaning against the railing and was also gasping for breath, explained to him that they were only doing some practical work following their superior's orders. Su-chan simply stared at them and remained silent. He remembered that the rat plague in his past life had also occurred at the Technology University. Connecting the dots, he realized it was related to the evolution base. With a calm look, he asked them if there were mutant rats in the research laboratory. The man started looking at Su-chan and explained to him that they had no idea about this matter since only the research staff could enter the laboratory. Upon hearing this, his expression changed drastically. With a determined look, he decided to go investigate the situation at the Technology University and take action before the rat plague outbreak. At the same time, waves of floodwater began to crash against the Green City Hotel, and Duanya, who was inside, luckily obtained a crystal core from the monster's brain. She absorbed the crystal nucleus, started looking down with a confused look, and began to scream. While she was sitting at the table and breathing heavily, she extended her hands to the sides, started staring at them intently, and wondered if she had succeeded. The floodwater entered the hotel, filling Su-chan's room floor. She put her foot on the ground and felt surprised to see that the water level had risen so much. At that moment, some tentacles began approaching her. Previously, while outside the hotel, it was raining, and the waves of floodwater were crashing against the hotel. Inside Su-chan's apartment, her eyes began to shine as her body emitted a powerful pink energy. She placed a hand on her elbow, turned her head to one side, stuck out her tongue, and started wondering what was happening. Several seconds later, she absorbed the crystal core, started looking down, and with a confused look, began to scream. While she was sitting at the table and breathing heavily, she extended her hands to the sides, started staring at them intently, and wondered if she had succeeded. The floodwater entered the hotel, filling Su-chan's room. She stepped onto the ground and, upon feeling the water, was somewhat astonished to see that the water level had risen so much. At that moment, some tentacles began approaching her. Duanya turned her head to the side and, upon seeing what was in front of her eyes, was shocked. The tentacles were actually the body of a mutant lamprey. Gradually, it opened its mouth and started climbing up her body. She looked down and, upon seeing how the mutant lamprey was slowly climbing up her body, became terrified and couldn't help but start sweating. With a fearful look in her eyes, she began to wonder what this thing was. Just before she could make any movement, the lamprey climbed up her body and, using its own body, wrapped around her, leaving her almost immobilized. When she felt unable to move, she looked down, and upon seeing that the lamprey's body was so slimy and gross, she couldn't help but feel disgusted. While she was lost in her thoughts, the lamprey approached her face. She began to look at it with a surprised expression and started sweating, wondering what was happening and how it had entered the hotel. When looking more closely, she saw that the lamprey opened its mouth, which was full of sharp teeth, and it began to approach her face. Now that she couldn't move, it started moving quickly towards her and prepared to attack. Upon seeing this, she turned her head to the side, closed her eyes, clenched her teeth tightly, and prepared herself for the attack. Luckily, the lamprey had immobilized her entire body except for her hands, so she quickly grabbed the lamprey by its head, preventing it from getting any closer. But then several more lampreys appeared and used their bodies to surround her arms. Upon seeing this, she thought that this was not good. If one mutant lamprey was already a problem, she didn't know how she would be able to handle so many of them. In the blink of an eye, the sticky lampreys coiled around her body, causing her to start sweating and getting nervous. Turning as red as a tomato, she began looking ahead and soon realized that she was completely trapped. Now she couldn't move. The lampreys coiled around her arms, and then several mutant lampreys appeared in front of her. They began to look at her with a murderous gaze, opened their mouths, and started approaching her. She lifted her head, and upon seeing so many, she couldn't help but panic and start sweating even more. While they were gradually approaching her, she slightly turned her head back, and with a serious look, she thought that this was bad since she hadn't even had time to adapt to her new special abilities. Several days ago, Su Chun reached out his hand, and while taking something out of the dimensional space, with a calm look, he started looking at her and explained that if one found and consumed the crystal core, then they would obtain special abilities. However, many monsters seemed normal, and one couldn't discern what abilities the core had just by its appearance. He reached out his hand towards her, causing an apple to start appearing. Duanya, who was dressed as a nurse, began to look at the apple and asked him if she didn't even know what special abilities she had, then how could she use them? Several seconds later, the apple came out of the dimensional space and appeared in his hand. He started looking at Duanya with a calm gaze and explained that one should only experiment, experience their own body, experience the environment surrounding them, experience all the changes, and then try to master and control the special ability. Upon remembering this, she began to look down at the ground and, with a smile, started to feel her special ability. The lampreys started to approach her. She turned her head to one side and began to see their brains shining through their bodies. Upon seeing their small brains, she decided to do something. She lifted her head, and while her eyes were shining, she began to stare at the lampreys with a determined look and gave them the order to stop. Upon hearing her voice, the lampreys stepped back and, with a confused look, started to gaze at her and wonder what was happening. Without hesitation, the lampreys stopped coiling around her body, freeing her. While her eyes were shining, she placed a hand on her chest, started looking down, and couldn't help but feel annoyed since now her whole body was sticky. On the table was the fire axe. She began to reach out her hand to grab the axe and asked the lampreys to wait a moment as she was going to take care of them now. She took the axe, rested it on her shoulder, approached the lampreys, put her other hand on her waist, started staring at them intently, and with a smile, decided to turn them into tofu. She grabbed the axe tightly and approached them. She started looking at them with an aggressive gaze, clenched her teeth tightly, and swung the axe with precision, cutting their bodies in half. Feeling pain, They opened their mouths and began screaming in agony. She began cutting the lampreys, causing blood to splatter on the walls. Several minutes later, she finished off all the lampreys. While holding the axe with one hand, she grabbed a piece of her dress with the other hand. Seeing that she was completely dirty, she decided to go back to her room and take a bath. While she was distracted, someone started approaching her from behind. This person was a man. As he was getting closer to her, he began looking at the ground and asked her if he could take a bath with her. Upon hearing this, she snapped out of her trance, slightly turned her head back, and with a surprised look on her face, started wondering who this man was. She grabbed the axe with both hands, turned her body backwards, started looking at the man with a furious gaze, clenched her teeth tightly, and asked him who he was. This man was none other than Suchan. While his body was surrounded by blue energy, he began to approach her, started looking into her eyes, and with a smile, praised her for finishing off the mutant lampreys and for knowing how to protect herself with weapons. Upon seeing that this man was Suchan, her expression changed drastically. She began to look at him with a surprised gaze and couldn't help but be in shock. Without hesitating for a second, she jumped on top of him, gave him a hug, closed her eyes, and explained that she was very happy to see that he had returned. She also added that she had been very worried about him. Having her so close, Suchan turned his head to the side and couldn't help but start sweating and getting nervous. She started feeling like something was pushing her. She opened her eyes, began looking at him, and while starting to blush, she asked him what it was. When looking more closely, she saw that he was naked. Quickly, she moved away from him, closed her eyes, extended her hands towards him, and asked him to get dressed. Suchan put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes, and with a smile, explained to her that the water was too dirty and that's why he had taken off his clothes. He decided to go take a quick bath. Several minutes later, the two went to Suchan's apartment and filled the bathtub with water. Both got into the bathtub. Suchan put his hands behind his head, closed his eyes, and with a smile, told her that this was very comfortable and also that only when one leaves their home do they realize that being at home is the best. She started blushing, lowered her head, and silently stared at her reflection in the water. She stood up and placed her hand on his shoulder. Feeling her touch, he asked her if she had awakened her special abilities. While Suchan had both arms resting on the edges of the bathtub, she approached him, put her hands on his shoulder, and as she started to blush, she asked him if he had seen how she had dealt with all the lampreys. He closed his eyes, and with a smile, he replied to her that he hadn't seen it, but he had felt it through the temperature of her mouth. Upon hearing this, she was somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. She asked him what temperature he was referring to. Suchan, who had his head resting on his arms, asked her what her special ability was. In response, she began massaging his back and explained that her power was a type of mind control power. Upon hearing this, he asked her if her special ability could work on food. She started to stand up and asked him if she could practice a little with him. Suchan opened his eyes, slightly turned his head back, and with a confused look, asked her what she meant by practicing. Upon seeing what his eyes were witnessing, he couldn't help but be in shock. She put on a sexy costume, placed a hand on her chest, started looking at Suchan, and told him that she wanted to do some exercise with him. Suchan turned his body towards her, placing both hands on the edges of the bathtub. While his body was emanating a demonic energy, he began to stare at her and remained silent. Upon seeing this, she couldn't help but be shocked. She started looking at him with a surprised expression and wondered if this was his special power. Upon feeling the oppressive energy emanating from Suchan, her expression drastically changed. She was astonished. If it weren't for Suchan's consent, she probably would have succumbed to his energy pressure. The moment she tried to escape, he began staring at her, and with a smile, he thought that her power was truly astonishing. He asked her what came next. At the same time, the moon's rising and nightfall approached. While the waves of water were crashing against the hotel, she replied that she wanted him to practice until his legs weakened. The next day, the sun came out and the floodwater calmed down. Someone pulled out a gun and started eliminating the remaining mutant lampreys that had entered the hotel, tearing their bodies into pieces. This person was Duanya. She was wearing a bunny costume. She wasn't alone. Next to her was Su Chen, who was holding her hand and helping her improve her aim. He began to look at the lampreys and explained to her that one should concentrate, calm down, and then shoot. As she started blushing, she asked him if he didn't go to the technology university and why he was wasting time here teaching her how to shoot. They were on the roof of the hotel. He put his hands in his pants pockets, started moving away from her, and while heading towards the door, he gave her until noon to familiarize herself with her powers and her aim. He also asked her if she was from the medical university. Duanya, who was holding the gun with one hand, replied to him, yes, and asked if something was happening. He stopped walking, turned his head towards her, and with a calm look, explained to her that she had to come with him. Several hours later, the water level of the Great Flood stabilized, and a yacht began sailing through the city. This yacht belonged to none other than Su Chen. Duanya asked him if it wasn't a bad idea to wear this clothing while being outside. He replied that nothing was going to happen since even if she didn't wear it, no one would be able to do anything to her. Duanya was the one driving the yacht and was wearing a bunny dress. With a worried look, she asked Su Chen if he had ever been to the Science and Technology University. Su Chen was sitting behind her, with one leg crossed over the other knee. He had one hand resting on the seat and was holding a glass of wine with the other. He began to look at her and remained silent, smiling. Several seconds later, he brought the glass of wine closer to him, stared at her intently with a serious gaze, and told her that he had come to the university to see a friend but didn't know if he had survived. While she was holding the yacht's steering wheel with one hand, she placed the other hand under her chest, started looking at Su Chen, and while blushing, asked him not to worry because people with good luck have their own destiny. The yacht was moving at high speed, cutting through the waves. Several minutes later, Duanya started looking to the side and informed him that they had arrived at the University of Science and Technology. What used to be the University of Science and Technology was now a fortress flooded with water from the flood. The entrance was blocked by two giant wooden doors. Their yacht approached the entrance, and at that moment, Su Chen turned his head to the side and with a murderous look, he realized that something bad was about to happen. His suspicions were correct. Someone who was watching the door peeked out, drew a rifle, and started shooting at the yacht. But luckily, Su Chen reacted in time. He approached Duanya, put his hand over her head, and stood in front of her. The bullets began to hit the yacht. He turned his head towards the man who was shooting and remained silent. The man guarding the door stared at Su Chen and asked him who he was and what he was doing here. While Su Chen's eyes were shining, he began to stare at the man and remembered that this was the Science and Technology University, the same place where the mutated Rat King had emerged in his past life. He stepped forward on the yacht, put his hands in his pockets, and calmly explained to the man that they were here to join the evolution base. He also asked if he could open the door and let them in. The man simply started looking at Su Chen and remained silent, deep in thought, while holding the AK-47 with one hand and resting the other on the wood. Upon closer inspection, he noticed there was a bunny girl on the yacht. He stuck his tongue out and told her that he would let her in if she stayed with him tonight. But he wasn't willing to let Su Chen in like so. He asked him to go back where he came from. At that moment, Duanya brought out a plate with delicious food. She closed her eyes and with a smile asked the man to open the door for the sake of this stewed pork. Upon seeing this, the man panicked, placed his hand on the wood, and with a surprised look, thought that the dish was indeed stewed pork. Underneath the man, there was another man named Lu Tao. Without hesitation, the man began pointing downwards, and with a look full of intrigue, he ordered Lu Tao to quickly open the door, as it had been a long time since he had seen any meat. Lu Tao was somewhat surprised. He started looking at him with a confused look and accepted his order without complaining. The large wooden door of the university began to open. Seeing this, Duanya returned to the steering wheel of the yacht and started driving inside. Once they reached the interior, the man who was guarding the door came down and ordered them to stop the boat and give him the stewed pork. After saying this, he asked Lu Tao to take them inside. He wanted to eat the stewed pork all by himself. While Duanya's eyes were shining, she started looking at the man and couldn't help but smile. On the other hand, with a serious look, Su Chen simply remained silent. The reality was that the stewed pork dish was nothing more than a monster's hand. The man grabbed the hand with both hands, and while drooling, he thought it smelled incredible. Out of love for this delicious stewed pork, he decided to let them in. He also added that he would have to send the guy to the laboratory at another time. Lu Tao took Su Chen and Duanya and decided to show them the way. Both of them started following him silently. In front of them, there were two dying men sitting with their backs against the wall. There was a starving man lying on the floor and a girl who was wearing a cape. While Lu Tao was sweating, he turned his head back and with a sincere look, he explained to them that since they were all going to live in the base from now on, it was important to support each other. He also added that the ground floor was for the elderly, children, and other untouchables. He decided to take them upstairs to find a clean room. Su Chun, who had his hands in his pants pockets, simply listened to Lu Tao without interrupting. At that moment, the girl stumbled and fell to the ground. Upon seeing this, he turned his body towards the girl, started looking at her with an aggressive gaze, and asked her what was wrong and if she couldn't walk. Duanya approached the girl, picked her up in her arms, placed one hand behind her back and the other on top of her arms. She began looking at her and realized that she was too hungry and had no energy left. She asked the girl where her family was. The girl's stomach began to growl. She put her hands on her belly, closed her eyes, clenched her teeth tightly, and started screaming in pain. She explained to Duanya that her family had gone in search of food and had not yet returned. Upon hearing this, Duanya took out a bag of bread from her pocket, started approaching it towards the girl, and told her that she could take it. The girl started to sweat, opened one eye, began to look at the bread, and her mouth watered. But despite this, she didn't accept it because if she ate the bread, then her little bunny sister would also go hungry. Su Chun, who was standing behind them, reached out to them and with a calm look, asked the girl not to worry because it was impossible for her bunny sister to go hungry. Upon hearing this, Duanya couldn't help but start looking at the girl and begin to blush. The girl, who was starving, started looking at Su Chun and told him that he was lying and also asked him what kind of person never goes hungry. Duanya, who was holding the girl in her arms, began to sweat and with a worried look, thought that if she didn't eat soon, she would die of hunger. Su Chun started looking at the ground and couldn't help but start smiling. He extended his hands forward, making a hot pot appear. He told her that she could question his character but not his strength. In a matter of seconds, he took out a hot pot and several plates full of food and placed them on top of a wooden box. After doing this, he reached down to the ground, started looking at the girl, and told her that if Duanya was his woman, then she would not go hungry. Upon hearing this, Duanya was somewhat surprised. She began to look to the side and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. Lu Tao, who was standing behind Su Chun, was shocked. He started looking at the food with a confused expression and couldn't help but wonder where this hot pot had come from. Upon seeing so much food, the girl was also shocked. She told Su Chun that she also wanted to be his woman. Upon hearing this, Duanya was somewhat surprised. She started looking to the side and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. She became jealous. She gave the piece of bread to the girl and explained to her that children don't say silly things. She asked her to simply eat quickly. The girl, who hadn't eaten in days, started eating the piece of bread and couldn't help but start crying and feeling like she was in heaven. Upon smelling the food, several men approached them. They couldn't believe that someone was cooking and eating here. Upon hearing their voices, Su Chen turned his body back and with a surprised look, began to wonder who they were. 3 armed men began to approach them. The man with black hair drew a dagger and started showing it to the others. The man with a mohawk kicked the wooden barrel hard. He ordered the others to get out of here, calling them an untouchable gang. He also asked them if they didn't know that hiding food was against the rules. The man who wore an eye patch was the leader. He began to approach them and explained that all materials had to be delivered first and then exchanged for contribution points. All the untouchables who were nearby started moving away from them and couldn't help but tremble in fear. He began to stare at Su Chun and remembered that nobody had exchanged food in the last few days. So, he asked them who was the person breaking the rules. The 2 men simply remained silent. Upon seeing the men, the girl, who was holding onto a piece of bread, stood behind Duanya, closed her eyes, and told her that she was scared. Duanya, who was sitting on the floor, placed her hand in front of her and with a calm look, asked the girl not to worry because she would take care of making sure they behaved well. After saying this, she began to look at Su-chan. He turned his head towards her and with a serious look, nodded. Upon seeing what had appeared in front of them, their leader couldn't help but be shocked and wonder what was happening. Duanya stood up, reached out to the side, started looking at the men, and asked if they weren't hungry after talking for so long. At that moment, Su-chan took some food out of the dimensional space, which began to appear near her hand. She explained to them that she had prepared these things for them. With a piercing look, she asked them to enjoy the food. On top of the wooden box, 4 plates with meat appeared. Seeing that there was a lot of meat, the 3 men started approaching like crazy and thought it smelled really good. They asked the untouchables to stay behind since all this food belonged to them. They began to drool. For them, this was like heaven itself. They took the meat and started eating like they had never done before. For them, this food was delicious, and the familiar feeling made tears well up in their eyes. Their leader began to stare fixedly at Duanya, started pointing at her with his finger, and while he had food in his mouth, began to smile. He called her a good girl and decided to punish her tonight. But as for Su-chan, who had broken the rules, he was going to be punished more severely. Duanya crossed her arms, started looking at the men, and remained silent. Su-chan, who had both hands in his pants pockets, became somewhat confused. He looked at the men with a surprised look and couldn't help but wonder how the man was going to punish him. With a penetrating gaze, their leader gave the order to his subordinates to bring them out. Upon hearing his command, his men brought out 2 men who were bound with chains. They had so much strength that 2 men were not enough. They began to approach Su-chan, who simply started staring at their leader and remained silent. The punishment was a life-or-death confrontation with these 2 men. Either he killed them, or they would kill him. He turned his head towards them, and as a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek, he looked more closely and saw that these 2 men were very familiar. He began to question if they were not the same 2 brothers from the Great Flood. The girl, who was eating a piece of bread and hiding behind Duanya's leg, peeked out to see who these 2 men were. When looking more closely, she saw that they were the older brother and the second brother. Upon realizing that they were about to engage in a fight to the death, she couldn't help but panic and start crying. She tried to intervene, but Duanya stopped her, placed her hand on her head, and with a confused look, asked her if those 2 were her brothers. The girl began to cry even more and tried to go help them, but Duanya grabbed her by the waist with both arms. The girl started reaching out her hand towards them, called the men bad guys, and ordered them to release her brothers. She also asked Su-chan not to go there as there was something wrong with them. The man with the mohawk, who was eating meat like a pig, told the girl that her brothers had ruined the mission and couldn't obtain contribution points as compensation. For this reason, they had been sentenced to death. Their leader, who was also eating like a pig, started smiling and told her that he was capturing them in order to have fun with them. He took a chicken thigh, took a bite, and started staring at Su-chan. He didn't expect them to actually know each other. For him, this was even more interesting. He decided that if he lost the duel, then he would let the little sister join her brothers. He planned to throw the girl into the water and feed her to the water ghosts. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.